Hey viewers. Tonight, we're cracking open a chapter of history that's rarely whispered about in textbooks, but was very much alive in candlelit corners and shadowy cloisters. Lust, sex, and sin in the Middle Ages. And before we start, just a heads up, you probably won't survive this. Not because it's too spicy. Well, maybe. But because if you'd lived in medieval times with a curious mind and an even slightly active libido, chances are you'd have ended up in the stocks, whipped or burned, or all three, depending on the week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I'd love to know, what city are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start tonight's pilgrimage, not in a bustling medieval town or a sultry tavern, but in a monastery. Yeah, not exactly where you'd expect to find a lot of sin. The air smells like candle wax, damp stone, and something faintly medicinal. It's quieterly so, the kind of quiet that makes every cough feel like a thunderclap. But even here, tucked away behind thick monastery walls and layers of vows, desire flickers like a stubborn flame. The monks around you wear wool robes, their hair shaved in a circular pattern known as the tonsure. They're supposed to have renounced the pleasures of the flesh. Lust is an enemy Hera, prowling beast. And yet, you notice how Brother Thomas avoids Sister Agnes' gaze just a little too pointedly during Mass. His fingers twitch when she walks past. She, in turn, clutches her rosary tighter than seems strictly necessary. You learn quickly that this isn't some one-off scandal. Medieval monasteries were battlefields of the body. Monks and nuns fought constant, exhausting wars with their own thoughts. Sex was the original spiritual enemy, especially because you couldn't just banish it with fasting and cold baths. There were confessionals full of slippery accidents, dreams that left garments stained, and private moments with saints' statues that really didn't age well. One of the more bizarre features you discover is that monks kept records detailed, awkwardly honest ones. There's a case of a 12th century abbot who confessed that the devil would show him visions of naked women in church. Yes, in church, during prayer. And did these visions tempt him? Oh, absolutely. He once described being so tormented, he rammed his face into the cold floor to calm himself down. Didn't work, by the way. In fact, some monasteries became infamous for their not-so-holy behavior. There's one story from France in the 11th century where the entire male and female communities of a double monastery were discovered in, let's call Eton, elaborate entanglement. And not metaphorically. The church responded by shutting it down and calling the whole place a brothel in disguise. What makes this more ironic is how monastic life was sold as the ultimate escape from sin. Want to flee the temptations of the flesh? Easy. Take vows, eat bland food, chant Latin, shave your head, but spoiler alert, it didn't work. If anything, isolation made things worse. Think about its zero distractions, long hours alone with your thoughts, the expectation of purity hanging over your head like a guillotine. That's basically an erotic pressure cooker. And don't think the women were exempt. Nuns wrote about their struggles too, sometimes in code, sometimes not. One 14th century nun described her nightmares of being seduced by black beasts with burning breaths, classic incubus imagery, and wrote entire prayers begging God to harden her soul so she wouldn't. Well, you get the idea. There's even debate among historians about how many of these supernatural accounts were metaphorical versus an actual way to exploit desire they couldn't process otherwise. Some scholars argue that calling it a demon was safer than saying, "I'm horny and I hate it." Now, let's take a quick detour to the stranger side of the monastery. Did you know some monks trained themselves to dream lucidly just so they could avoid lustful imagery while asleep? Like literal dream yoga, but the medieval, Catholic, guilt-saturated version. One obscure monk named Hinrich claimed he could recite psalms in his dreams to drown out any seductive thoughts. Was it true? Who knows? But the fact that they even tried that tells you how desperate they were. And then there's the elephant in the cloister, actual affairs. Despite all the rules, plenty of monks and nuns had secret relationships, smuggled letters, nighttime visits, hidden tunnels. A few were even discovered with children. That's right, children. In some convents, pregnant nuns were quietly sent away to repent, and the child either ended up abandoned or mysteriously adopted by local villagers. The official line, miraculous conception or trickery by the devil. Sure, still, not all monks were tragic, cautionary tales. Some were fully committed to suppressing their desires, and a few managed it. There were saints who allegedly never once had a sexual thought, and others who claimed to have achieved total purity. But here's the debate: did they really? Or were they just very good at hiding it, or redefining what pure meant in their journals? Either way, your stay in the monastery leaves you with this weird dual feeling: awe at the intensity of their struggle, and sympathy for the fact that these people were told that even thinking about sex meant damnation. That's a tough burden when, let's be real, people are gonna people. Even in 1142, you leave through a side door as the Vespers begin, the chant rising behind you like smoke. Outside, the moon hangs low, and somewhere nearby, a nightbird calls. You're heading deeper into this medieval world, now where the line between holiness and horniness keeps getting blurrier. And next up, saints with visions that would definitely raise some eyebrows. You don't get far from the monastery before finding yourself wrapped in another tale, this one drenched in incense and mystery, flickering candlelight and sweaty hallucinations. Saints, those holy paragons, weren't exactly immune to lust either. In fact, the deeper you dig into their lives, the more you realize many of them spent years locked in what can only be described as deeply personal, occasionally erotic showdowns. With the devil land, sometimes with God, you slip into the shoes of a medieval believer, somewhere between skeptical and spellbound, as you pore over the lives of Saints Vita, as the Church called them. These weren't just dry moral summaries. Oh no, these stories came with plot twists, seductions, naked apparitions, physical torment, and spiritual ecstasy that got confusingly close to the other kind. Take Saint Anthony the Great, for example. The poor guy fled into the desert to escape temptation and wound up with even more of it. According to his biographers, demons sent visions of women throwing themselves at him. Their bodies shimmered, their eyes sparkled, and classic Mauve Anthony rolled around in a thorn bush, to stop his impure thoughts, not metaphorically, like actually dove into it. You're not sure if that worked, but you can't deny the dedication. But it's not just the men. The female saints get even weirder. Meet Saint Catherine of Siena. She took a vow of virginity at 7-7 as an adult. She claimed she was spiritually married to Christ, even receiving a ring that, according to her, was made from the foreskin of Jesus. Yep, you blink, reread, and there it is, again, foreskin. Medieval hagiography had no chill. And then there's Saint Teresa of Avila. Although, technically, she lived a bit after the medieval period. Her writings reflect centuries of mystical eroticism. She wrote of an angel piercing her heart with a flaming spear, causing her to writhe in pain and joy so intense it left her utterly consumed. If that sounds vaguely like a romance novel scene involving divine BDSM, you're not alone. Scholars still debate whether these visions were purely spiritual, or whether Teresa was channeling suppressed desires into her metaphysical language. Some even argue she was having out-of-body, orgasmic experiences, and just didn't have the vocabulary for it, so she called them divine ecstasies. These accounts weren't fringe tales tucked away in dusty corners. They were popular, widely read, even used as instructional material for other devout souls. The takeaway was clear. Spiritual perfection required confronting lust head-on, and the way you defeated it, well-affirmed by enduring increasingly surreal, occasionally sexy torments. But here's the twist that makes you raise an eyebrow. Sometimes the saints enjoyed the visions. There are passages where the tone shifts from horror to awe, from disgust to wonder. St. Lardus, a 13th century mystic, claimed that Christ kissed her on the mouth romantically. In one vision, his hands caressed her heart. She felt flooded with warmth and heard divine music. Was it symbolic? Maybe. Was it also the only acceptable framework for a woman in that society to describe any kind of intense pleasure? Almost definitely. That's where the open debate comes in. Were these saints truly transcending the flesh or just finding loopholes? Some modern historians suggest these holy visions were often the only safe container women had to express desire, intimacy, and pleasure, a kind of spiritual drag show where they slipped into a role society allowed and used it to say what they couldn't say openly, even stranger. Some of these visions mirrored common erotic tropes of the time: the swooning, the breathlessness, the feeling of being overcome, helpless. The language of religious ecstasy bled into erotic poetry and vice versa. And honestly, after a few hours reading through these saintly accounts, you start confusing them with courtship scenes from romance tales. One moment you're reading about a nun's dream of being enveloped in divine light. The next, she's describing a sweetness unlike any earthly touch. You start suspecting these women had very vivid imaginations and very few outlets. Meanwhile, the church walked a delicate tightrope. On the one hand, these mystical experiences were signs of divine favor. On the other, if a vision got too spicy, suspicions of heresy, madness, or even demonic possession weren't far behind. Plenty of mystics, especially women, walked that dangerous line. Be too pious, and you might be declared a living saint. Be too sensual about it, and you might find yourself on trial. You duck into a small chapel to catch your breath. Inside, there's a mural of Saint Margaret holding a dragon by the tail end, Honestly, it's not the most innocent image. Everything in this era had double meanings. That's what's so fascinating. No one could talk openly about sex, but everyone knew what they were dancing around. Saints, poets, even bishops played this coded game. And of course, not every saint made it out unscathed. Saint Christina, the astonishing her, names not even the weirdest part, was said to levitate, throw herself into furnaces, and dive into icy rivers to resist temptation. Her entire biography reads like a medieval fever dream. Some think she suffered from epilepsy or a neurological condition, and her visions were misunderstood. Others see her as a mystic, genuinely trying to wrestle with the contradictions of body and soul in a world that punished both extremes. You exit the chapel just as a bell tolls in the distance. Another reminder of how closely time and ritual wrapped around desire in this world. These weren't just stories for the faithful. They were survival guides, cautionary tales, wish fulfillment, and, if we're being honest, slightly erotic fanfic for people who couldn't read. The Canterbury Tales without blushing. By the time you hit the road again, the saints feel less like flawless icons and more like exhausted humans trying to make sense of overwhelming impulses. It's comforting in a strange way. Even the most divine couldn't escape desire's pull. They just found more elaborate, poetic ways to wrestle it. And speaking of poetic wrestling, you're headed next to the courts of love where knights pine, ladies plot, and nobody's really as noble as the songs say. You arrive at a sprawling castle just as the sun begins to dip behind the towers, casting the stones in a warm golden hue that makes everything look slightly more romantic than it really is. Inside, a feast is being prepared. Roasted meats, spiced wine, fruit piled high, and you can already hear the pluck of lutes and the low drone of poetry recited in aching tones. Welcome to the world of courtly love, where desire is celebrated. Flirtation is an art form, and yet absolutely no one seems to be getting laid. You take a seat in the great hall, observing the players of this peculiar game. Over there, a knight kneels before a noblewoman, eyes smoldering, voice trembling as he vows eternal loyalty. He praises her eyes, her grace, the way she walks across the floor like a swan on a lake. Blah blah blah. She, in turn, accepts his devotion with just the right amount of disinterested raised eyebrow, a smile that could be mistaken for kindness or cruelty. They exchange small keepsakes, perhaps a glove, a scarf, or even a literal lock of hair. But if he thinks that earns him entry into her chambers, he's sorely mistaken. This is courtly love in its most refined and tortured form, and you quickly realize it was likely invented by someone who found emotional suffering oddly satisfying. It's not about fulfillment. It's about the ache, the unreachable ideal, the belief that love must remain unconsummated to stay pure. You begin to suspect this entire cultural obsession was the medieval version of edging. The poets of that era, troubadours and trouvers, specialized in this genre. They wandered from court to court, singing about unattainable women and the exquisite agony of yearning for someone they'd never touch. One of the most famous was Chrétien de Troyes, who gifted us stories of Lancelot and Guinevere, along with other familiar dramas where real love is always out of reach or must remain hidden, because someone already pledged themselves to a king or rival lord. Sure, these stories were technically fiction, but they deeply influenced real-life behavior among the nobility. Aristocrats began to mirror what they read. Noblewomen would flirt just enough to spark obsession, but never enough to lose control. Knights, in turn, would do the absurd joust dragons, slay beasts, write candlelit sonnets for the reward of a glance or whispered word. You start thinking maybe the real goal was the performance, the notion that yearning was nobler than having. But here's the catch. That was just the polished surface. Scratch a little deeper, and you find that these so-called chaste declarations often masked real affairs, especially in courtly settings, where political marriages were common. Actual love had to be found elsewhere. You trail a few couples into hidden corridors and watch as the formality drops. The longing becomes contact. The poetry becomes whispers. And all that noble restraint becomes an excuse to sneak behind a tapestry. One juicy example. Eleanor of Aquitaine and her court of love. Icily, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century. She essentially held salons where aristocratic women would debate the rules of romance, like it was a medieval season of The Bachelor. Should a man pursue someone else's wife? Is jealousy a sign of true love? How do you test a suitor's loyalty? It all sounds philosophical till you realize many participants were already tangled in affairs with the very knights composing those flowery verses. Still, courtly love came with rigid rules. Chief among them, it was supposed to remain non-physical, that kept it just shy of sin. The church didn't love it, it smelled too secular, too rooted in fleshly admiration instead of spiritual devotion. But it was hard to condemn a knight for saying he admired a lady's soul, especially when it came with flowery metaphors, and yet the boundaries were always shifting. You stumble on a tale of a nobleman who sliced open his own skin with a dagger to prove his love to a woman who had spurned him. Moved by his act, she agreed to a secret meeting. You think this is the moment something finally happens, but no. They sit and talk. She tells him he's won her heart, and he promises eternal loyalty. That's it. No kiss, no embrace, no payoff. Everyone leaves, unsatisfied, including you. But even these restrained romances carried enormous weight. A single flirtation could ruin reputations, collapse marriages, even ignite wars. Kings became jealous. Queens turned clever. Knights switched allegiances. You watch this play out slowly, the way a stolen glance becomes court gossip, and gossip spirals into scandal. A lady passes you, murmuring, "It's not the love that's dangerous, it's the politics." And she's right. You also stumble upon a fringe theory. Some scholars argue that courtly love was a form of literary cover for real political maneuvering. Noblewomen, often trapped in arranged marriages, used these romantic rituals to assert subtle power, choosing whom to flirt with, whom to praise, whom to humiliate. That glove wasn't just a gift, it was a strategic play on a chessboard. And then, of course, there's the sex or lack thereof. Some historians argue that courtly love was a proterotic performance, a socially acceptable outlet for passion. Others say the sex was there all along, just cloaked beneath dense layers of metaphor and verse, thick enough to baffle even the nosiest chaperone. After all, medieval writers rarely said they slept together. They said things like, "He sought shelter in her garden." You know, very subtle. By the night's end, you realize you've been witnessing an elaborate masquerade. Everyone plays at being virtuous, while secretly plotting access to flesh. Lust here wears the costume of longing. It's choreographed, disguised, and yet still burns through layers of silk, lace, and fan fluttering like wildfire. You step out into the night air, cool and perfumed, with crushed rose petals and wine. Somewhere behind you, a poet is still reciting to a half-interested duchess, but you're heading somewhere else now. You've seen how the aristocrats pretend. Now it's time to learn how the peasants really live and how they navigate life. Without privacy, without power, and without poetry, you leave the velvet and lute-filled world behind. No more rich drapes or delicate dances. Now the air grows heavier thick with the smell of earth, wood smoke, and livestock. You find yourself in a cramped medieval village somewhere in northern Europe, maybe England, maybe France. Homes are built from timber and thatch, clustered close together. There's no concept of personal space, much less privacy. Yet love and lust still flourish even if it's without the luxury of embroidered bedding or poetic metaphors. You duck into a small cottage, stooping beneath the low doorway. The room inside is tiny, just one space, shared by all. One bed, maybe two, if they're lucky. Parents, children, sometimes even livestock sleep within arm's reach of each other. And here's where things get creative. In some regions, there's a practice called bundling or bed courtship, a custom where unmarried couples are allowed to lie in bed together, fully clothed, separated by a board or sackcloth, to talk and bond. It was a test of compatibility. In theory, yes, really. Intimate conversation in bed under the watchful eye of family or neighbors. Of course, the idea was to not have sex, but come on, they were teenagers, they were curious, and they were literally surrounded by hay. You can do the math. Sometimes this led to what people delicately called premarital negotiation. If a girl got pregnant, the boy was often expected to marry her. Shotgun weddings weren't rare. Neither was the community's quiet acceptance that maybe the bundling bag wasn't exactly airtight. What surprises you is how communal it all is. In a world with no walls, the village becomes the witness and judge of every romance. Neighbors gossip, families interfere. Reputation is everything. You hear about a custom where local women would inspect the sheets after a wedding night to confirm consummation. If there was blood, all was well. If not, the whispers began. You wonder how many clever brides stained the linen in advance, just to avoid humiliation. Sex among peasants isn't veiled in symbolic performance the way it is among the elite. It's practical, sometimes sweet, often urgent. You see couples steal moments in the forest, behind haystacks, wherever the birds and leaves can hide them briefly. Some get caught, sure, but the consequences are often milder than you'd expect. A modest fine, maybe a brief round of public penance. Everyone seems to understand that desire rarely waits for the church's approval. Still, boundaries existed, and crossing the wrong ones could be dangerous. Adultery, especially when it involved someone of higher social standing, could result in exile, flogging, or worse. Among the lower classes, though, sexual missteps were usually handled by the community itself. You witness an unusual tradition known as chivalry, where a man who marries a much younger woman or is suspected of infidelity gets paraded through the streets on a donkey, while villagers bang pots and yell insults. It's part punishment, part public theater, and carries the stinging scent of petty revenge, cloaked as moral virtue. Yet, there's humor woven into it, all a kind of earthy realism. A stout midwife with a gap-toothed grin pulls you aside, muttering, "Let the Lord preach his sermons. Babies arrive when they please." She's delivered dozens of infants, some born to married couples, others not tanned. None of it seems to bother her. In fact, she jokes openly about how many noblemen have left their blessings in village cradles. And yes, that's a thing. Noblemen would sometimes exploit their status to seduce or coerce peasant girls, resulting in children of complicated standings, some discreetly welcomed into the village, others openly rejected. What strikes you is how unceremonious marriage can be here. Sometimes it's as simple as a handshake witnessed by a few neighbors, an agreement to share work, food, and a bed. The church, of course, prefers a priest's blessing, but in many rural places, tradition carries more weight than ritual. If you live together and the village sees you as a couple, you are one. It's a surprisingly flexible system until something goes wrong, but not everyone fits neatly into village life. You meet a widow who whispers of the woods, women young, girls who fled into the forest, either to avoid the shame of an unwanted pregnancy or to practice folk magic that gave them some control over fertility. Secret herbs change hands, teas meant to bring on the moon, charms hidden beneath skirts. Some of it's practical, some pure superstition, but all of it speaks to how fiercely women tried to reclaim agency in a world that offered them so little. And here comes the night's strangest, most beautiful detail. In certain parts of medieval Europe, couples who couldn't afford a priest's blessing would carve love runes into tree bark, not just as a romantic gesture, but as a kind of spiritual insurance. If the church wouldn't sanctify their union, nature would. Eternal, sacred, accessible. You pass by one such tree, initials barely legible beneath moss and age, and can't help but wonder how many generations of secret passion it's absorbed. Historians still argue about how common sex before marriage truly was among peasants. Some point to church records filled with fines and penance. Others argue those records only document the rare scandals. One thing's clear, the rules in sermons and the realities of village life often clashed. Desire finds cracks. It slips through shadows. In these medieval hamlets, it shaped lives with a raw honesty sometimes more humane than anything written in noble poetry. As you leave the village behind, boots caked in mud, your mind hums with images, dim hearths glowing, whispered, vows under blankets, kisses stolen behind barns. The peasants may not have had velvet or verse, but they had heat, risk, and tenderness carved into bark and burned into memory. Next, your path curves back toward the cloisters, but this time women are in control. Nuns with ink-stained fingers, and secrets laced between the pages of prayer. You step through the groaning gate of a convent, expecting incense and hymns. Instead, you're hit with the tang of vinegar and the surprising scent of roasted onions from the kitchen garden. The air is cool, clean, and loaded with stories that no one speaks aloud. Nuns cross the courtyard like ghosts, in linen heads bowed, hands folded, robes whispering with every step. On the surface, all seems calm, but you can feel something pulsing beneath it, something human. The convent is meant to be a fortress against temptation, a place where women renounce the flesh and devote themselves wholly to God. And yes, outwardly, it follows the blueprint: rituals, prayers, hours of silence, manuscripts copied with surgical focus. But as you settle into the rhythms of this place, it becomes clear: this is no lifeless retreat. It's a sanctuary of thought, emotion, and sometimes desire. You find yourself in the convent's library, where the scent of old parchment mingles with beeswax. An older sister, amused by your curiosity, opens a small cabinet and reveals something rarely shown to outsiders. Private writings, not theological essays, not psalms or liturgical notes. These are fragile diaries filled with longing, visions, shame, and half-whispered dreams scribbled between lines of Latin. Some of it is spiritual, yes, but not always how you'd expect. One entry describes a dream in which the Virgin Mary cradles the writer with such overwhelming tenderness it feels more like ecstasy than comfort. Another recounts being kissed on the mouth by an angel again and again until the nun wakes gasping, unsure if she's been blessed or cursed. You're not even sure which she prefers. Another page describes golden hair like ripe wheat, the warmth of another sister's hand during prayer, and the silence between them heavy with something unnamed. It reads like a love letter buried inside a sermon. There's a mournful undercurrent to what you read, never overt, but unmistakably present. And as it turns out, this wasn't just an isolated case. Across Europe, from England to Italy, scholars have uncovered letters and poems passed between nuns, sometimes coded in metaphor, sometimes shockingly direct. One nun in Germany wrote of her aching desire for the warmth of Sister Clara's body. Another, living in a remote French outpost, confessed to seeking God's mercy for dreaming of carnal pleasure while sharing a bed in winter. Wait, sharing a bed. Oh yes, convent dormitories were communal. In colder months, it wasn't uncommon for 2 or more nuns to share a straw mattress. It was practical, economical, and whether intentionally or not, an open door to intimacy. Physical affection was technically forbidden, but enforcement was patchy. There were no cameras, no evidence, just dim candlelight, thick woolen robes, and very human needs. And some things weren't even hidden. In fact, certain abbesses kept startlingly honest records of misconduct. You find one entry describing a nun caught beneath a staircase with a visiting monk. Another tells of a local butcher's daughter smuggled onto convent grounds disguised as a laundry girl. Punishment varied sometimes. It meant isolation, extra prayers, or stern admonishments. But if noble families were involved, scandals were often hushed, buried beneath layers of discretion. Then there were love tokens, tiny wooden crosses, carved trinkets, handwritten notes tucked inside rosary pouches. One nun buried a letter beneath a cherry tree, addressed to the one whose voice haunts me in sleep. She didn't sign it. She didn't have to. Everyone already knew. But it wasn't always about forbidden love or secret passion. Many of these women were intellectual powerhouses, desperate for stimulation. They devoured texts: Augustine, Plato, even sneaky doses of Roman poetry if no one was watching. They debated theology late into the night, translated sacred manuscripts, and wrote mystic reflections that, if you tilt your head just slightly, read like erotic poems wrapped in holy language. One visionary nun wrote of her soul being pierced by divine fire, opened like a blossom before the light. If that's not metaphorical foreplay, what is? Here's your fringe fact for the evening. Hildegard of Bingen, renowned 12th century abbess, mystic, and composer, once described a woman's soul as capable of becoming pregnant with divine inspiration. Some modern readers interpret that as a form of spiritual queerness. Hildegard also had a deep, possibly romantic bond with another nun named Richardis. When Richardis was transferred to another convent, Hildegard sent a storm of sorrowful letters. Her grief reads less like holy lament and more like a heartbreak album in Latin. Were these relationships romantic, platonic, emotional coping mechanisms forged in all-female spaces? Did these women understand their desires the way we understand sexuality today? There's no single answer, but one thing is absolutely clear. These were not blank, obedient vessels. They lived rich, tangled, emotional lives far from the passive, angelic image church propaganda preferred. You also learn that many women didn't choose convent life willingly. Families sent daughters into religious life as economic or political strategies. If a girl wasn't pretty enough to marry well, or if she had too many sisters ahead of her in line, she was packed off to a nunnery. Some found purpose and peace, others didn't. One diary holds a single gut punch of a line: "I do not love my vows, but I obey them." It lands harder than any sermon. And then there were the rebels, the unruly nuns who sneaked out at night, drank in taverns, even took lovers. In 14th century Italy, one convent was discovered throwing masked balls within the cloister walls, complete with hired musicians and wine. When church officials arrived, they found laughter, music, and a remarkable absence of guilt. The women were reprimanded, yes, but not expelled. Why? Because several were related to bishops. Surprise, as you walk back through the moonlit cloisters, light filtering through arched windows, a hymn rises from the chapel. It's beautiful, haunting, but beneath the harmony lies a more complicated truth. These women, so often painted as paragons of purity, were filled with longing, inner conflict, creativity, and secrets. Maybe even more so, cloistered away, with only candlelight and each other for company. Next, you're stepping into the heavy hush of a confession booth where the air is thick with incense and whispered sins. On the other side of the screen, a priest who might be more familiar with temptation than you'd expect. You cross the cold stone threshold of a medieval church. Sunlight filters through stained glass windows, scattering shards of color across worn wooden pews. The air smells like centuries-old incense, clinging to every crevice. The altar gleams faintly in the distance, but your attention is pulled to a darker corner, the confessional. It's a small wooden box, more like a holy closet lined with secrets. You slide inside, pulling the curtain closed behind you. The air inside is musty, still, as if holding its breath with you. Across the screen, the priest clears his throat. What unfolds next is not exactly what the doctrine promises. Theoretically, the medieval confessional was sacred, a space for cleansing the soul, a ritual to unburden one's darkest impulses before God. In practice, it was far more human and far more complicated, because the man behind the screen wasn't just a conduit of divinity. He had ears, curiosity, and, sometimes, let's be real, questionable restraint. Confessions could be uncomfortably explicit. Parishioners didn't just seek forgiveness, they sought clarification. Was this thing they did with their spouse or their neighbor or a wandering minstrel a sin? You overhear one confession, a trembling young man whispering that he let a girl touch his shameful member while bathing. The priest doesn't scold him. Instead, he asks questions, detailed ones that sound less like pastoral guidance and more like covert curiosity. And that's not shocking. Priests were often the most educated men in town, but that didn't make them immune to temptation. In fact, it sometimes gave them more access. Technically, parish priests were bound to celibacy, church law since the 12th century, but enforcement was loose. In small villages there weren't many eyes watching, so when a local priest took a lover, most people simply turned their heads and he got reckless. Take the case of Father Gerard. He had a quiet reputation for offering extra private confession to certain widows. One in particular visited him every week after dusk. Neighbors swore they saw candlelight flickering in his rectory, well past midnight. Eventually, a bishop came to investigate. Gerard wasn't defrocked. He was simply reassigned, shuffled off to a remote monastery. No scandal, no punishment, just a fresh start with new souls to shepherd. Even the most devout clergy had their quirks. One friar brother Luco was famous not for his sermons, but for his obsessive record-keeping. He maintained a ledger not of names, but of sins. Specifically, how many parishioners confessed to carnal urges. Each tally marked not a person, but a type, a frequency. Flesh reduced to numbers. The patterns he recorded were strange, to say the least. He noted curious trends. Mondays, for example, saw the highest number of self-pollution confessions, and married women, surprisingly, reported impure dreams more often than unmarried maids. Whether this was a spiritual census or just a voyeur's log of human weakness is hard to determine. Then there's the truly bizarre. Some priests didn't just hand out generic penance, no casual say 5 Hail Marys here. Instead, they prescribed oddly specific punishments. Things like walking barefoot to the chapel 3 times while chanting Psalm 51, fasting for 40 days while sleeping on bare stone, or, in one extreme case, a man guilty of bestiality was ordered to carry a candle taller than himself through town during Mass. The point wasn't just repentance, it was shame, spectacle. Whether it actually deterred anyone, that's debatable. And confessions didn't just flow from the laity. Priests, too, sometimes unburdened their sins privately to fellow clergy or to their superiors. When guilt pushed them past silence, records reveal clerics admitting to affairs with nuns, widows, even their own housekeepers. Some were penitent, others defended themselves. She was lonely, one wrote. I thought we were married in God's eyes. Another, more defiant, simply stated, the flesh was stronger than the soul. I regret little, of course. Not every priest was a wolf in vestments. Many genuinely wrestled with temptation, confessed their thoughts with sincere anguish. But even those who stayed faithful to their vows weren't safe from suspicion. A priest who was too handsome, too gentle, or too familiar with local women might find himself accused anyway, in a world where sex and sin were knotted together. Even kindness could bloom into scandal. You also learn about the rare but real presence of female confessors, members of specific religious orders, trained to hear women's confessions. Their approach was often more clinical, less scandalized, and sometimes harsher. Still, many women preferred them. After all, it was easier to confess to someone who shared your body's struggles. Imagine trying to tell a blushing young priest about a sensual dream involving Saint Sebastian. Now imagine telling a woman who's had one herself, but at its core, confession wasn't always about spiritual cleansing. Often, it was about control. The church accumulated tremendous power by becoming the vault of everyone's secrets. They knew who was sleeping with whom, who desired what, who doubted what tanned. They used that knowledge, sometimes for guidance, sometimes for leverage. A nobleman who confessed to adultery might be advised gently, of course, to fund a new chapel. A baker caught frequenting brothels might lose his stall at the town market. Guilt, it turns out, made an excellent currency. And this is where scholarly debate rages. Some argue the confessional was less a sanctuary than a surveillance tool, an early system of psychological discipline, keeping minds tangled in self-suspicion. Others insist it offered genuine relief, rare space where people could speak freely. The truth likely lives in between. Confession was many things at once: therapy, trap, comfort, and risk. When you finally step out of the booth, the carved wood groaning behind you, the sun is slipping low on the horizon. Church bells toll in slow, echoing waves, less a call to prayer, more a warning. You've heard so many sins whispered through that screen, and not all of them stayed buried. Some became gossip. Others grew into full-blown scandal. Some shaped entire communities. Crossing the courtyard, it hits you. In this world, sin wasn't just something you did. It was a story to tell, a weight to pass on, a confession waiting for ears. And next, you're in the town square where private desire becomes painfully public performance. By the time you arrive, the square already hums with the tension of anticipation. It's that kind of low murmur that rolls through a crowd before something violent or thrilling. Villagers jostle for space. Cloaked merchants stand shoulder to shoulder with barefoot children. Old women settle with baskets at their feet. All eyes are locked on the central platform, where the wooden stocks have been cleaned and oiled. Nearby, a barrel overflows with softening vegetables. Welcome to medieval justiceware. Sin didn't just haunt your soul, it earned you a front row role in public. Humiliation. Today's unfortunate star is a woman in her 30s. Her hair is a mess. Her cheeks are flushed not with shame, you suspect, but with rage. The accusation is adultery. The details, fuzzy. The man, absent as usual. She, however, is here to be strapped into the stocks, wrists and ankles locked in place for the town's entertainment. You feel it instantly. This isn't about justice. It's about theater. The villagers haven't gathered just to uphold morality. They've come to enjoy its collapse. Children giggle as they aim mushy turnips. A drunken cobbler yells slurs about loose women before nearly tripping into a pig trough. And beneath all the noise, there's something darker: cruelty. Delight at watching a woman punished for wanting what she shouldn't have wanted. Public shame for sexual offenses was far more common than most assume. Adultery, fornication, even bawdy speech could land someone in the pillory. Sometimes it was just a fine. Other times it meant a whipping, a shaved head, exile, even branding. The punishment varied wildly by region, by gender, by status. But the message never changed. Lust is dangerous. Act on it and prepare to pay. And women paid more, paid more. A married woman who strayed physically or emotionally was seen as a threat to the entire social structure. A man, he could often shrug it off, claim seduction, and move on. You see the imbalance in every record. Men caught with prostitutes, fined; women accused of being prostitutes, whipped, marked, or forced to wear humiliating garb in one town. They had 2 Dan-striped hoods in publica, literal scarlet letter, sewn into fabric, and punishment wasn't always for acts of sex. Sometimes it was for breaking roles. You find a case where a man was humiliated for cross-dressing in secret. His crime, wearing his wife's dress while cleaning. No sex, no victim. Still, he was dragged into the square, dressed in women's clothing, and pelted with sheep dung. It wasn't about morality. It was about control, enforcing the boundaries of gender, class, and desire. Then there's the brothel keeper, the woman who ran a quiet business from her cellar. When she was caught, she wasn't executed. She wasn't even jailed. Instead, she was paraded through town in a cart, holding a wooden sign that read "Mother of Horses." No one said a word. No one dared. They knew anyone could be next. Not all punishments were so extreme. Sometimes all it took was flirting too boldly. You read a court record from Norwich. One woman was put in the pillory for calling a merchant's apprentice ripe fruit at the market. It wasn't the phrase that got her punished. It was the fact that she had the nerve to say it. Her real offense, saying it loud enough for the wrong priest's wife to hear. In this world, the line between flirtation and transgression was razor thin and often depended entirely on who happened to be listening. Now, for tonight's quirky, almost unbelievable historical detail. In some regions of medieval France, married couples caught publicly fighting over infidelity were forced literally to kiss and make up. They'd be marched into the town square, occasionally in chains, made to kneel before one another, confess their faults aloud, and share a kiss in front of a full audience. Refusing meant risking steeper penalties. Imagine apologizing through clenched teeth, garlic on your breath, half the village staring. Welcome to medieval romance, public performance. Valves designed to vent tension, enforce conformity, and let the public bond over someone else's shame. Some argue that these public displays weren't about justice at all. They were rituals, communal catharsis through shared judgment. It made them feel better about their own hidden failures. Others see something more sinister, a performance of power, a way to remind people who made the rules and who would be made examples of when those rules were broken. Back in the square, the woman in the stocks has gone quiet. Her gaze is locked on a point far beyond the crowd. No more turnips fly. The crowd is losing interest. Somewhere off to the side, a flute begins to play. The moment has passed. Tomorrow, someone else will take her place. A drunk, a thief, maybe another lover who made the wrong move at the wrong time. You step away, your boots crunching over cabbage leaves and discarded shame. The sun dips lower, casting long, jagged shadows over the square. It strikes you how easily pleasure becomes punishment here. How the very things people crave are transformed into weapons to break them, and yet they keep craving. Now you're heading into even darker territory, where desire isn't just sinful, it's demonic. A woman is about to stand trial for consorting with something infernal. You may want to hold your crucifix close. You arrive. On the outskirts of a village, just as torches begin to flare, casting warped shadows against timbered walls, the air is damp with earth and smoke. But beneath it all is something sharper, something you can almost taste fear. It coils through the streets like fog, thickening near the church, where a crowd has already gathered, but they're not here to pray. This is a trial not for theft, or blasphemy, or even adultery. This is the kind where the accusation burns, hotter than the truth, where demons are given names and flesh. A woman is being charged with sleeping with the devil. Her name is Isabeau. She's in her mid-30s, a widowed herbalist, and the mother of 2. She's also attractive, independent, and rumored to know which herbs bring on a woman's bleeding or put an unfaithful husband to sleep. That's more than enough to raise suspicion in these parts. You push through the gathering crowd until you catch a glimpse of her hands bound, dress torn, her sleeve ripped at the shoulder. Her eyes burn not with guilt, but with rage. This isn't about potions. This isn't about gossip. And disturbingly, the villagers seem a little too eager to believe it. The priest, puffed up and oiled like a parade goose, reads the charges in a tremulous, dramatic voice. She did consort with a demon in the form of a man. She did permit it to enter her body by unholy means. She did cry out in pleasure, not in pain. A hush ripples through the crowd. Some people cross themselves. Others lean in, visibly intrigued, not out of morbid curiosity. Well, maybe a little, but because you know how these trials go. They won't just question her soul. They'll demand every sordid detail. What did the demon look like? Did it have claws, hooves? Did it whisper in Latin or moan in her dead husband's voice? That's what they're asking now. And yes, a notary is scribbling it all down. What's astonishing is how detailed these accounts often became. The Inquisition's records are filled with women describing nighttime visitations, some terrifying, some strangely romantic. The beings were sometimes monstrous, sometimes tender. Some forced themselves into dreams. Others crept in like old lovers. But no matter the variation, the church had its explanation ready. Incubi, male demons. Their goal: tempt women into sin, steal their seed, and use it to breed darkness. It was a convenient theory. It explained everything from night terrors to damp bedclothes. A holy narrative for very human sensations. Then Isabeau speaks. Her voice trembles but holds. She says the devil came to her in the form of her deceased husband. He touched her, kissed her, lay beside her like he used to. It felt real. She wanted it to be real. And with that confession, the crowd shifts against some toward sympathy, more toward horror. Because she didn't just say the devil came. She said she liked it. That is the ultimate heresy. The irony is thick enough to choke on. The very men who shout loudest against desire are the ones who believe. Satan spends his nights seducing people, especially women, especially alone, especially in ways that mirror their own fantasies. There's something darkly comic about that, or tragic, or both. Then comes the part you dread most, the examination. Yes, a physical inspection. A midwife is summoned to search Isabeau's body for a witch's mark, some blemish, birthmark, or patch of skin that feels no pain. Under torchlight, she's stripped and examined, poked, prodded, judged. It's invasive, it's degrading, and, worst of all, it's deadly serious. Of course, they find something, a freckle, tucked on the inside of her thigh. The priest declares it the devil's kiss. And with that, the accusation becomes inescapable. Scholars still argue about what was really happening in these trials. Did these women actually believe they had slept with demons? Were they coerced into stories by men who knew exactly what they wanted to hear? Or were they simply desperate, saying whatever might end the pain? Some historians say these were erotic dreams, misunderstood by both the dreamer and the society. Others believe the church itself projected its sexual panic onto these women as a way of controlling bodies and silencing autonomy. Because the truth is, they were healers, widows, midwives, women who didn't fit, women who lived alone, women who knew too much. The real crime wasn't lust, it was independence. Accusing them of demonic sex made the charges lurid, impossible to disprove, and impossible to ignore. And if the woman admitted to enjoying it, well, that sealed her damnation. Because in this world, a woman who likes sex is already halfway to hell. You stumble across one chilling detail in an old judicial report. In some trials, women were asked what the demon's seed felt like inside them. The assumption, if it was cold, that was proof. If she said it was warm, more hesitated, she was lying. That's how far they went, using imaginary semen temperature as evidence. You don't know whether to laugh or scream. The torchlight dances across the square as the verdict is announced, guilty. Isabeau is sentenced to public penance and flogging. She'll be marched barefoot through the town, clothed only in a thin chemise, carrying a candle taller than she is. If she survives the humiliation, she may return to her home, or, like many others, she may vanish burned quietly, her name never recorded again. As the crowd disperses, scandalized, already retelling the story, you hear the whispers. Some say she flew at night. Others claim she gave birth to a toad. The line between sex and sorcery here isn't just thin, it's weaponized. And next, you'll step into the world of medieval virtue tech where desire is restrained not by prayer but by iron. Time to talk about chastity belts. You're standing inside a cramped stone chamber tucked into the rear of a fortress. At the center, resting atop a splintered wooden table, lies the object of your curiosity, catching a beam of sunlight like a sacred punchline. A chastity belt, iron, lined with leather, cold and unyielding to the touch. The front plate covers everything with a twisted sort of elegance pierced through with small holes, supposedly for hygiene. It locks at the hips with a key roughly the size of a baby goat. Welcome to the uneasy meeting point of lust, fear, and medieval innovation. The myth of the chastity belt is a potent one. You've probably heard it many times. Noble knights locking up their wives before riding off to the crusades. Women encased in metal to preserve their purity. Husbands wearing the key like a perverse wedding ring. It sounds like a cautionary fable wrapped in iron. But as you study this one more closely, something feels off. It's too polished, too ornamental. It doesn't look worn, it looks displayed. That's your first clue that the truth might be murkier than the myth. Historians are still arguing over whether chastity belts were ever widely used at all. Sure, there are museum pieces and a few Renaissance illustrations that depict women trussed up in these contraptions of control. But most surviving examples date from the 15th century and beyond. Some, suspiciously, appear to be 19th century. Fakes likely crafted to titillate rather than terrify. That's right. Some so-called medieval chastity belts may have been the Victorian version of fetish props cosplay accessories for gentlemen with very specific tastes. Still, the idea didn't come out of nowhere. The medieval church was obsessed with regulating female sexuality. Chastity wasn't just a virtue, it was currency. Virginity held theological weight, carried social value, and secured political marriages. So the idea of locking it down literally fit neatly into a culture that prized control above comfort. Whether or not anyone actually wore iron underwear, the metaphor, the fear, the fixation, they were all very real. You flip through some old manuscripts and stumble upon a few written mentions. None are especially kind. One Italian tale recounts a jealous merchant who had a belt forged by a blacksmith to preserve his wife's virtue. Another describes a nobleman who forced his daughters to wear them whenever they left the estate. No one mentions how long they were worn, how bathing worked, or how infection was handled. Those details were either left out or simply imagined. And then it gets stranger. Some belts weren't just designed to block intercourse, they were engineered to prevent pleasure. One model you examine has tiny inward-facing spikes, like a reverse hedgehog. Another was so restrictive that walking normally would have been nearly impossible. Scholars suggest these devices were punishments, not preventative tools meant to discipline unruly women or sex workers in particularly repressive city-states. Whether those were rare exceptions or part of a wider practice is still heavily debated. And it wasn't only women. You come across a sketch of a male chastity device, an iron codpiece that resembles a meat grinder. Apparently, some men were forced to wear them during spiritual penance or by vengeful wives in retribution for infidelity. One story, possibly apocryphal, tells of a young monk who begged his abbot to lock him up to keep his urges under control. Now that's commitment to celibacy. Even with the scarcity of physical evidence, the chastity belt took hold in the medieval imagination. Poets referenced it, preachers condemned it, satirists made fun of it. One bawdy French ballad tells of a woman who bribed a locksmith, then managed trysts with 3 different lovers before morning mass. Another joke tells of a crusader returning to find his wife pregnant still, wearing the belt, and the key dangling from his own neck. The punchline, where there's a will, there's a workaround. You find a curious historical record from 16th century Nuremberg about a man who tried to sell a virtue device at a public market. The town council had him flogged not because the device was immoral, but because the whole concept was considered absurd and fraudulent. Even then, people raised eyebrows at the idea that anyone could be padlocked into purity and expect it to work. Modern historians often argue that the chastity belt was more symbolic than real, a metaphor for sexual control, a theatrical warning, a narrative tool. By the time the Renaissance arrived, the image had evolved into something more allegorically used in paintings and pamphlets as commentary on jealousy, control, and hypocrisy. In that way, it's a close cousin to other shame devices, like the scold's bridle or the shame flute objects that may have existed but whose myths outpaced their actual use. Still, when you hold the replica in your hands, cold, heavy, laughably unwearably, feels something undeniable. Whether it was ever worn or not, it feels medieval, controlling, brutal, suspicious of the body. And in that sense, it fits the world you've been exploring, where sin is hunted, punished, and never far beneath the surface of virtue. Whether or not anyone was truly forced to wear one may not matter, as much as the fact that everyone believed someone could. You exit the fortress, crossing a courtyard where once perhaps lovers danced beneath fluttering banners and gossiping stares. Your mind is still tangled in images of iron and absurdity, of the belief that desire could be locked away and forgotten. You know better now, and now you're on your way to a wedding not for love, but for duty, where the real excitement isn't the vows, but what happens after the feast. You arrive just as the wedding feast is reaching its boisterous peak. The air is thick with roasted meat, sticky wine, and onion-soaked laughter. Nobles draped in velvet shriek a little too loudly at half-funny jokes. At the head table, beneath a finely embroidered canopy, the bride and groom sit like co-workers, forced into a bizarre team-building exercise. She's pale and stiff, eyes downcast, staring at her hands as if willing herself to disappear. He's already drunk, grinning at something no one else finds amusing. Love isn't the focus here. Everyone's waiting for the real entertainment, the bedding ceremony, yes. The moment where pretense falls away and the newlyweds are publicly escorted to their marriage bed. The crowd isn't even pretending to be discreet. They're singing songs, making filthy rhymes about animals and fruit, and cracking jokes loud enough to echo off stone walls. It's invasive, it's absurd, and it was entirely normal in medieval Europe. A marriage wasn't valid until consummated, and in many cases, proof wasn't just hoped for, it was demanded. You follow the parade up a narrow staircase lined with flickering candles. The couple is led into their chamber like livestock, into a stall. Nobles, priests, servants, even the bride's aunt squeeze in to witness the undressing. There are rules, of course, no touching, only watching. Encouragement is allowed. Teasing. One courtier tosses flower petals. Another strums a lute. It's surreal. The couple slips under the sheets. The curtains are drawn only halfway, because everyone wants to know when it's done. You might think such scrutiny would kill the mood, but that was never the point. This was about legitimacy, not intimacy. Marriages weren't about romance. They were transactions, ways to move land, wealth, titles, and consummation made them binding. That leads you to the infamous bridal sheet ritual. In many places, once the deed was done, or claimed to be done, the bed linens were displayed, often outside the home, for all to see. Blood on the sheet meant the bride was a virgin. No blood, that was a scandal. Rumors spread, dowries were returned, alliances shattered. In one infamous case, a groom annulled his marriage on the spot and demanded his money back. The bride was 15. Her father sued for slander. The court sided with the bedsheet. Of course, not all women bled, and many knew it, so they got creative. There are whispered accounts of brides pricking their fingers, hiding animal blood beneath the sheets, bribing servants to lie. One merchant's daughter allegedly kept a vial of chicken blood sewn into her corset just in case. Virginity was a currency, and illusions were often safer than truth. As for the groom, no one asked if he was a virgin. In fact, it was assumed he wasn't. Young men were often encouraged to train before marriage, sometimes with sex workers, so they'd be ready to perform. You come across a Spanish medical treatise warning grooms to avoid excessive excitement or haste, lest their brides become disappointed and suspicious. She was expected to arrive untouched. He experienced fair, not remotely. You even uncover a strange regional tradition from Central Europe where the bride's mother stayed in the room not to witness the act, but to supervise modesty. She'd sit in the corner, hands folded, humming softly, pretending it wasn't awkward for everyone involved. In other cases, a priest would sprinkle the marriage bed with holy water before slipping out with whispered instructions. Remember, Christ is watching, no pressure, and here's your strange but true fact for the night. In medieval Scandinavia, if a marriage wasn't consummated within 3 days, it could be legally annulled. And yes, people checked. One story tells of a noblewoman whose lingers just a fraction longer than custom allows. These are the signals that had to suffice. In a world where same-sex love was unspeakable, it was instead spoken through gestures, through poetry, through silences, in the official view of the church hand. Thus, the law homosexuality wasn't just a sin, it was an abomination, a crime against nature itself. The word sodomy became a catch-all term, encompassing everything from consensual same-sex acts to bestiality, from masturbation to acts that were merely suspected of straying from the procreative norm. And the penalties, harsh in some regions. It meant a fine, in others, mutilation. In the worst cases, fire. And yet, behind closed doors, in letters written with careful euphemism, in songs passed through markets, people still found one another. You hear about Brother Alaric, a monk whose illuminated margins contained far more than theological flourishes. In one, he sketched David and Jonathan embracing, their bodies too close, their expressions too tender. He was eventually reassigned to a quieter priory for health reasons. You find a court record from Florence, late 14th century, in which several young men were arrested for gathering in an abandoned wine cellar. Their crime, dancing too close, laughing too much, sharing bread and wine in the wrong way. The trial transcripts read like a farce. Who kissed whom, who touched where, who said TMO when the door was still open. One man, when questioned, everything. Another wept and confessed. A third remained silent, offering nothing, not even a name. He disappeared from the records after that. Maybe fled, maybe worse. And yet, despite the risks, there were places where same-sex desire managed to breathe, in certain parts of medieval Arabic and Andalusian poetry. Male love was written about openly coded, yes, but beautifully. You come across verses praising the curve of a boy's neck, the sorrow of forbidden affection, the ecstasy of stolen moments under olive trees. One scribe in Seville copied them onto the backs of tax ledgers. His own quiet rebellion. In convents, the line between spiritual intimacy and emotional longing could blur. Letters between nuns reveal a depth of feeling that modern eyes might read as romantic. Sister to sister, their words speak of beloved faces, of aching absence, of nights I cannot sleep for thinking of you. Maybe it was only affection, maybe not. That ambiguity was its protection. The church said same-sex love didn't exist. So it survived in the spaces between definitions. It became invisible, resilient, not erased, but reshaped. And there were, too, the rare moments of boldness. In 1292, Two women in France were caught living together as husband and wife. One, dressed in male clothing, took the name Jean and was eventually tried for fraud and heresy. The court demanded to know how she played the part of a man. The records note that the courtroom laughed at the phrasing, but no one laughed at the punishment. You feel the weight of all these stories as you walk. The tension between presence and erasure, between what was forbidden and what persisted anyway. There's something deeply human in it, this quiet insistence on being, even when the world denies you. Love that whispers through cracks in the wall, that hides in poems and passes between fingers brushing in the dark. And here's your quirky, piercing fact of the night. In some medieval love spells, regardless of gender, people used the same incantations. The object of desire didn't matter to the magic, just the yearning, just the need to be near. Even the supernatural knew what the priests denied. Love is love. Whatever shape it takes, you step back into the main street, the alleys behind you, soft with memory. You've walked through lust, through judgment, through fire and iron and sermons. But this part, this secret tenderness, this quiet defiance, it may be the most courageous of all. Next, you'll find yourself in a brothel. Yes, that kind, but not just to leer, to understand how sex work shaped, sustained, and sometimes protected women who had few other choices, and how their stories complicate everything the church thought it knew. They wore badges, small metal tokens, often pinned to their clothing, that identified them as licensed workers. These badges were stamped with symbols like lions, moons, or the city's seal. It was part regulation, part protection, part marketing. Think of it as medieval sex work ID, but with flair. Some even had numbers, which sounds dystopian until you remember this was the same era that numbered lepers and tax ledgers. And here's the twist. Despite the badge, the oversight, the church sermons, many of these women formed tight-knit communities. Some supported each other like family. A few even pooled money to buy their way out of the business, or to care for each other when illness or pregnancy struck. You find records of sex workers donating to local churches, sponsoring candles for saints, even leaving money in their wills to fund almshouses or schools. Respectable women in every way except officially. The church, ever hypocritical, condemned them publicly, while using their presence to keep respectable women safe and keep men moral. A priest might preach about fornication in the morning, then visit a brothel after Vespers. Confession wiped the slate clean. Again and again. There's even one case from 15th century Germany where a bishop was caught running his own brothel under an alias. The scandal only came out when he shortchanged the tax collector, not the morality, mind you the math. And what about the courtesans? They were a different breed, less regulated, more refined. In Venice and Milan, some women rose above the brothel system entirely, becoming educated companions to poets, diplomats, and nobles. They read Latin, recited Virgil, debated politics in salons, and, yes, they took lovers for money, but they were also influencers before that word existed. They advised princes, published poetry, hosted the brightest minds of the age. One famed Venetian courtesan, Veronica Franco, not only defended herself before the Inquisition, but published an entire volume of letters and poems calling out the hypocrisy of male desire. You want my mind in the day, and my body at night, she wrote. So pay me twice. What you're seeing across the board is contradiction. Women criminalized, yet essential, praised in secret and shamed in public. Legal sin managed lust, bureaucracy cloaked in virtue. And that's the medieval world for you. A place where sin was taxed, love was hidden, desire was feared, and yet everyone still burned with it anyway. As you leave the brothel district smelling like roses and wood smoke, realize that control was never the point, not really. The church, the city, the sermons, they never truly eradicated lust or love or longing. They just tried to manage it, stamp it, shame it, hide it. But the body remembers, and so do the stories. Next, you're heading into a quiet graveyard at the edge of town, not to mourn, but to listen, to find the hidden memorials, those who didn't fit, forgotten lovers, anonymous sinners, and saints who weren't saints at all. Bring a candle. The names are faint, but the echoes still linger, and everyone was listening. In a world obsessed with controlling desire, fashion became a form of resistance and a language all its own. The church preached modesty, but sumptuary laws tell a different story. Those laws, scattered across medieval Europe, were obsessed with who wore what, not just for economic reasons, but for moral ones. They tried to regulate extravagance, how many buttons on a sleeve, how sheer a veil could be, how tight a bodice was laced, because if a woman's waist looked too inviting, or a man's cloak shimmered a little too suggestively, well, that could lead straight to sin, which of course made people want those things even more. You pass by a merchant hawking imported silks from the East, textiles that were once reserved for nobility, but now make their way into the wardrobes of ambitious courtiers and clever courtesans. There's a shade of blue, lapis deep and impossibly expensive, that makes a noble woman across the square look like she's lit from within. She knows it, too. The flick of her veil, the tilt of her chin, this is practiced, intentional. Clothing as spellwork. You notice the layering, a fine linen chemise peeking out from under a tight-laced kirtle, the outer garment slashed to show off the color underneath. Its subtle striptease hidden beneath the language of fashion. In medieval France, some gowns were sewn so tight across the chest that they had to be stitched closed after the woman was already wearing them. To undress was to unpick the seams thread by thread. Suggestive, extremely practical, not really. But that wasn't the point. And it's not just women. Men, too, wielded fashion like a weapon. Take the cote-hardia, form-fitting doublet that emphasized a young man's figure, worn with brightly colored hose that made no attempt to hide the body beneath. Or better yet, codpieces, those ostentatious, padded pouches sewn over the groin. At first, they were just functional think, medieval zipperfly. But by the late 15th century, they became decorative, exaggerated to the point of parody. The message was obvious and absurd. Masculinity, stitched and stuffed. One court satirist wrote that you could judge a man's ambitions by the size of his codpiece. Another quipped that some were so large they needed scaffolding. In many ways, these clothes weren't just garments. They were social clues, power moves, invitations. A fur-lined collar could imply wealth. A translucent veil might suggest virtue, the opposite. A bit of embroidery at the hemline could wink to a lover, hidden in plain sight. And while the church railed against vanity, it still used clothing to mark hierarchy, robes for bishops, cowls for monks, veils for virgins. Everyone had a uniform. Everyone played the game. Here's your quirky textile fact for the night. In certain convents, nuns would embroider their own undergarments with religious phrases, not out of piety, but as subtle rebellion. One surviving piece from 14th century Spain reads, "In temptation, remember, I am covered." Was it a joke, a charm, a quiet complaint? Hard to say, but it proves even the hidden layers carried stories. You flip through a merchant's sample book and notice the fabric swatches labeled by mood, for mourning, for feast, for seduction. Imagine a world where your hemline hinted at your intentions, and everyone around you was fluent in that code. Scholars still argue about just how sexualized medieval dress really was. Some say it was mostly symbolic. Others point to fashion manuals and moral tracts obsessed with exposed necklines, parted hair, and the curvature of hips as proof that clothing was not just about covering the body, it was about framing it. And in a time when desire was forbidden, that frame became everything. You leave the market, trailing your fingers along brocade and burlap, wool and lace. Behind you, someone whistles low at the sight of a swaying skirt. Ahead, a priest preaches temperance beside a tailor-fitting satin sleeves. The contradiction is everywhere. Dress like a saint, be watched like a sinner. Cover up too much, you're hiding something. Reveal too much, you're flaunting it. And yet everyone's still dressing, still choosing, still seducing. Because in a world that tells you not to want, even fabric can become a form of longing. Because when the church preached modesty and restraint, people did what they always do. They got creative. The merchant waves you over, eager to show off his imported goods. He holds up a length of fine Italian silk, dyed blue with crushed lapis and thin as breath. It catches the light, shimmer slipping over its surface like water. For noble ladies, he says, but you can tell it's not meant to cover much in the upper classes. Layers of gauze and silk weren't just luxuries. They were strategic distractions. A neckline that dipped just far enough. A sleeve that clung to the curve of a wrist. A hem that lifted a little too high in motion. Skin was always a flicker away. Sumptuary laws, those fancy words for clothing restrictions, were supposed to stop this, issued by the church and secular authorities alike. They dictated who could wear what. Commoners couldn't wear velvet. Prostitutes had to wear specific colors. No woman could wear pearls unless her husband earned a certain income. And no one, not even queens, was supposed to show too much flesh. Naturally, everyone ignored these laws or found clever ways around them. You see a woman passing by in a gown that hugs her hips a little too closely, the lacing along her back deliberately tight. Her head is covered, yes, because modesty, but her hair peeks out in golden curls from beneath her veil. That's intentional. In fact, hair itself was considered wildly erotic. Theologians wrote treatises about it. St. Paul said women should keep it covered, lest they tempt men into sin. But behind closed doors, hair was unbound, brushed, scented, and displayed for lovers, like a personal striptease. Then there are the shoes. Oh, the shoes. In the late Middle Ages, men wore poulinslong, pointed shoes that stretched several inches past the toes, curving up like a wink. The church hated them, called them prideful, sinful, obscene. Why? Because the longer your shoes, the richer and therefore more sexually suspect you appeared in some regions. The points were rumored to indicate the size of another protrusion. You try not to laugh, but the logic is deliciously absurd. Women had their own tricks, fitted bodices, side lacing that accentuated the waist, cloaks that could be pulled closed or left open just enough, were often infused with herbs, rose, lavender, frankincense-scented signals that said, "I'm clean, I'm wealthy," or sometimes, "I'm ready." There were no Chanel counters, but the effect was the same. Smell, texture, color, each a code. The church, of course, panicked. Over and over. Sermons warned that rich fabrics led men to sin, and women who dressed too finely were temptresses of the devil. One preacher warned that silk clung to the body like Satan to a soul. Another said fur-lined sleeves were like velvet paths to hell. You wonder if he ever touched one. And here's a quirky fact for the night. Some medieval men wore codpieces, little fabric pouches at the front of their hose, not just to protect themselves, but to exaggerate what they had. Early on, they were functional. But by the 15th century, they'd grown ambitious, padded, stuffed, embroidered. Some were shaped like literal animal heads, or held open like flower petals. One even had a tiny dagger sewn to it for no discernible reason, except maybe overcompensation. The codpiece became such a symbol of masculine virility that scholars today still debate whether it was more about sex or status or both. A knight in a well-fitted doublet with an oversized codpiece wasn't just saying, "I'm a warrior." He was also saying, "I have heirs, and possibly I have syphilis," since some were designed to hold medicated cloths for infected men. But let's not ruin the fantasy just yet. Meanwhile, in courtly circles, fashion turned into foreplay. Lovers would give each other clothing, tokens, a glove, a ribbon, a sleeve. These weren't just sentimental, they were invitations. A ribbon worn on the arm signaled devotion. A dropped handkerchief could launch a scandal. You read one love poem where a man spends 10 lines describing the texture of a woman's stocking before ever mentioning her face. Clothes made the body visible and hidden at once, a game of suggestion and denial. Not all messages were private. In some places, clothing became political. During the 100 Years' War, English women were forbidden from wearing French styles, a subtle way of aligning loyalty with morality. To wear the wrong cut or fabric was considered almost treasonous, as if lace could betray a kingdom. You find yourself staring at a gown in a tailor's shop. Green velvet laced up the front with slits at the sleeves that let the linen underdress puff out like clouds. It's sensual without being vulgar, expensive without being loud. You can see a noblewoman wearing this at court, carefully not spilling her wine, smiling just enough at her rival's husband. She knows what she's doing. Fashion in this world is not frivolous, it's strategy, it's language, and yet the rules still hung heavy. A woman who dressed too finely could be called vain. A man who wore soft fabrics could be mocked as effeminate. Gender norms were as stitched into clothing as the embroidery. One record from London shows a man arrested for wearing a woman's cloak and acting coy. He was fined and forced to parade through the city in drag while being pelted with dung. It wasn't just about fabric. It was about keeping everyone in their place. Scholars still argue over whether these fashions liberated or constrained. Did they let people express secret desires through symbols? Or did they just wrap lust in another layer of social expectation? Like so much in the Middle Ages, the answer lies in the tension. People wanted to feel beautiful, wanted to be desired. And when speech failed, fabric spoke for them. As you leave the market, the wind lifts the edge of your cloak, and a passing man glances too long, too bold. You ignore it, but the message is clear. You're part of the game now, dressed or undressed. You carry the story of your body wherever you go, wherever you go. And so, the incubus and succubus were born shape-shifting spirits who slipped into your bed when your defenses were down. The incubus, male, assaulted women. The succubus, female, preyed on men. Though, to be honest, the rules got fuzzy pretty fast. Some demons apparently didn't care about gender. Some switched forms. Some took on the shapes of lost lovers or dead spouses, easing their way into dreams with familiarity, then taking what they wanted. You flip through a dusty copy of the Malleus Maleficarum, that charming 15th century witch-hunting manual, and find entire chapters dedicated to demonic lust. The author's two fanatical inquisitors claimed demons collected semen from sleeping men and used it to impregnate women. Stealing seed became their explanation for untraceable pregnancies, nocturnal emissions, and even homosexual encounters. It was, in their minds, a logical system of infernal reproduction. Totally scientific, completely insane. But the fear was real. People believed their dreams were not private. If you woke up flushed, panting, or with signs of arousal, you could. Admitting to arousal meant danger. Others claimed to see beautiful men who whispered Latin and kissed their necks as they recited psalms. You think about how lonely those cloisters must have been, and how easy it is for suppressed longing to wear the mask of a nightmare. Not everyone feared the demons, though some tales read suspiciously like fan fiction. One woman in Milan was put on trial for claiming she willingly slept with a demon who appeared as a dark-haired knight. The court condemned her as a heretic, of course, but you can't help wondering if she just found a clever, dangerous way to talk about her desires. If society gives you no safe language for wanting, you borrow the devil's. The church naturally leaned into the horror. Preachers gave long, terrifying sermons about lustful spirits that waited for the careless. They warned that masturbation summoned succubi, that dreams of sex opened your soul to possession, that pleasure without purpose was a doorway to damnation. They described demonic lovers who left claw marks, sucked the life from you, made your limbs heavy and your mind foggy. He calls her marked by hell. But here's the quirky twist. Some medical writers didn't blame demons at all. They thought it was just bad digestion. Yes, really. In certain medical texts, particularly from the Islamic world, and later translated into Latin, nighttime emissions and erotic dreams were said to be caused by vapors rising from the stomach to the brain. The solution, better food, fewer onions, maybe a laxative, which, honestly, is kind of refreshing. The open, scholarly debate, though, is about what all this meant socially. Were demon lovers just metaphors for sexual repression? Were they a scapegoat for trauma, desire, or consensual acts turned scandalous? Some argue they were a cultural coping mechanism, a way to make sense of a body that betrayed you in sleep, or emotions too volatile to name. Others believe that these visions and visitations were, at least in part, performative stories designed to satisfy both the confessor and the confessor's audience, whether that be a priest, a judge, or a crowd hungry for lurid details. You climb a narrow staircase into the attic of a forgotten priory and find a manuscript filled with scribbled prayers. In the margin, a monk has drawn what appears to be a woman with wings kneeling on a man's. You stare at it longer than you mean to. The lines are shaky, but intentional, tender even. It doesn't look like a warning. There was fascination that the line between fear and fantasy was thin and easily crossed. In a world that declared desire monstrous, people didn't stop wanting. They just gave their hunger horns and wings and said it came in the night. You turn onto a road leading away from the village, past a shrine where someone's left a candle burning low. The night is quiet, but you wonder who will dream of whom. You'll flip through pages of early medical guides and anatomy texts, because when it came to sex, the so-called experts had ideas, some brilliant, some ridiculous, all deeply medieval. You find yourself in a cramped stone chamber that smells like dried herbs, burnt parchment, and a trace of something sour, possibly regret. A massive book lies open on the table before you, its vellum pages smudged with ink and oily fingerprints. Welcome to the world of medieval medicine, where sex and science shared a very awkward bed. The physicians of the time weren't just trying to cure plague or diagnose fevers. They were also deeply invested in figuring out what your genitals were up to and why they wouldn't behave themselves. You begin reading one of the most famous texts of the era, De Secretis Mulierum, on the secrets of women. The title sounds mysterious and kind of poetic until you realize it's mostly a weird mix of anatomy, theology, astrology, and total nonsense. According to this text, a woman could conceive only if she orgasmed. Yes, medieval medical wisdom stated that female pleasure was not only natural, it was necessary, which honestly sounds progressive until you remember that it meant pregnancy was proof of female desire. So if a woman claimed rape, the fact that she conceived was considered evidence that she must have enjoyed it. Nightmare logic that this belief came from a blend of ancient sources like Galen and Hippocrates, filtered through a fog of mistranslation and Christian paranoia. Galen, for example, believed that male and female bodies were essentially the same except women were turned inside out. Testicles became ovaries. The penis became the vagina. It was all a matter of heat and moisture. Men were hotter and drier, therefore superior. Women were cold and wet, therefore unstable, emotional, and frankly, a bit leaky. You flip to an anatomical drawing of a woman, and it's mostly guesswork. No nerves, no clear reproductive system, just a kind of mysterious, hollow tunnel leading to a vaguely defined womb, shaped like a wine flask. Next to it, a caption reads, "The uterus has 7 chambers, 3 for boys, 3 for girls, and 1 for monsters." You blink. Monsters. Yes, apparently, the 7th chamber could produce changelings, freaks, or demons, depending on the alignment of the stars and how much garlic the mother had consumed. Medieval physicians believed in the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. These governed everything from your temperament to your sex life. Too much blood, you were lustful and rash. Too much black bile, melancholy, probably celibate. Sexual desire, they believed, was caused by excess heat. That's why women were often considered more sexual than men. They were thought to store more internal moisture, which built up pressure and needed release. So yes, in some texts, female masturbation was actually recommended as a form of treatment. Better to spill than to swell, wrote one medical friar. And if that isn't the tagline for an herbal supplement, it should be. But while the theory suggested women had stronger sexual appetites, socially, this was a ticking bomb. A woman who was too lusty was seen as dangerous and unnatural. There were endless debates about how to control female desire. Cold baths, chastity belts, heavy diets of lentils and vinegar. One guide recommended wearing rough woolen garments to discourage the senses. Another suggested keeping women occupied with embroidery to avoid idle and wandering thoughts. You picture a nun stitching flowers into linen while thinking about the monk who smiled at her yesterday and wonder how effective that really was. Men didn't get off much easier, while male sexuality was assumed and even encouraged, especially for producing heirs. There was still a lot of panic around when and how it was expressed. Nocturnal emissions were a big concern. Pollution, they called it. Some doctors believed it weakened the heart and clouded the mind. Others warned that it opened the body to demonic infiltration. One poor student in Paris reportedly confessed to ejaculating in his sleep thrice weekly and was told to fast, pray, and sleep on hard boards until the devil left his loins. You find a particularly bizarre passage in a physician's notebook explaining how to determine if a woman was a virgin. According to him, you should examine her urine, watch her walk, and see whether she laughs too easily. Virgins, he wrote, walk upright, laugh modestly, and hold their eyes downcast. If she looks you in the eye, probably not a virgin. If she laughs loudly, definitely not. If she limps, who knows? And here's your quirky fact of the night. Some medieval sex manuals included recipes for aphrodisiacs involving ingredients like roasted ants, powdered vulture liver, and wine mixed with goat testicle. One particularly potent potion claimed to inflame the loins and soften the heart. Nettle oil on your thighs, or sleeping with an apple under your pillow and eating it in the morning to absorb the dreams of love. Despite the absurdities, not all of it was fantasy. Some early texts recognized the clitoris, though they often misunderstood it. There were diagrams, however rudimentary, that acknowledged female pleasure. Midwives, more grounded than the male. Physicians kept oral knowledge about birth, menstruation, and reproductive health that actually worked. It's just that their wisdom rarely got written down unless a man overheard and claimed it as his own. Scholars today argue over how seriously these manuals were taken. Some say they were academic exercises, more philosophical than practical. Others believe they were used like early health guides read in monasteries, passed around university libraries, consulted by midwives and apothecaries alike. What's certain is that they reflect a culture obsessed with regulating sex, understanding sex, and completely failing to do either. As you close the book, your head is swimming with imaging-stained fingers, misunderstood anatomy, priests, scribbling about lust with the intensity of poets. It's clear that even the experts weren't immune to curiosity, or arousal, or confusion. And when knowledge fell short, they filled the gaps with myth, metaphor, and just enough Latin to make it sound official. You step out into the daylight, blinking. Somewhere nearby, a couple is arguing over a bundle of herbs. A midwife scolds a child for throwing a turnip. Life moves on. The human body, with all its mystery and madness, keeps doing what it does. And next, you'll follow it far from home onto ships and dusty roads, where holy men forget their vows and pilgrims stumble into temptation in foreign lands. You wake to the creak of wagon wheels and the low chant of a pilgrim's hymn echoing off the dusty road. The sun is already brutal, the horizon shimmering in heat as you join a stream of travelers making their way toward something sacred, or at least officially sacred. This is a crusade route, a pilgrimage path, a ribbon of devout feet and tired bodies stretching from Europe into the Holy Land, or toward Canterbury, Santiago, or Rome. And while everyone here claims they're walking for their souls, the reality, of course, is much messier. You're about to learn that piety and libido are far more frequent travel companions than anyone wants to admit. You first fall in step beside a monk-brown robe, sandals worn smooth, eyes fixed on the path ahead. He tells you he's taken vows: poverty, obedience, chastity, but his voice cracks a bit on that last one. It's different out here, he mumbles, looking away. On the road, you've heard that before. Pilgrimage, with all its spiritual baggage, also brought anonymity, new towns, no relatives watching, and in many cases, no real oversight, which means that people who left home to purify themselves often found themselves neck deep in the very sins they claimed to flee. In one roadside tavern, you witness a knight drinking heavily, boasting that he's taking the cross, but his hand is firmly planted on a barmaid's thigh. Nearby, two supposed pilgrims play dice for a girl's scarf, possibly stolen, definitely scented. These travelers aren't all holy. Many are bored, some are broke. More than a few are looking for redemption. In the same place, they're also looking for flesh. A surprising number find both in the same bed. This isn't some fringe phenomenon. Towns along pilgrimage routes had entire economies built around servicing the bodies of pilgrims, not just feeding and housing them, but offering companionship of a less than holy nature. Temporary brothels popped up like mushrooms along the trail. Some were disguised as bathhouses, others didn't bother pretending, and in Jerusalem itself, crusaders were famously accompanied by a retinue of camp followers, many of them sex workers, who marched just behind the banners of the cross. In fact, when King Richard the Lionheart led his crusade to the Holy Land, he didn't just bring knights, he brought women, lot of women. Some were noble companions, others were washerwomen, the preferred euphemism for traveling lovers, paid or not. Church leaders huffed and puffed, of course, but nothing much changed. Crusades were months, even years long. Men wanted release. Women wanted protection, food, or sometimes just the chance to escape their pasts. Sex wasn't the exception on these journeys. It was routine. You flip through a soldier's diary carefully, preserved in a German abbey, and find an entry that reads, "We prayed at the tomb of Christ, and after I lay with a girl from Acre, she smiled as if I had blessed her." It's not regret, it's remembrance, and it tells you everything. The holy mingled with the profane so thoroughly that sometimes even the pilgrims couldn't tell the difference. And it wasn't just straight-laced knights falling into temptation. Monks and priests traveled to, and many saw pilgrimage as a loophole. Far from their bishops, their abbots, their parishioners. They could sin quietly and return repentant. One friar from Avignon was known to travel with a cousin who mysteriously resembled a young novice in a borrowed dress. They switched roles. In different towns, he heard confessions. She called them, and here's a fringe fact you'll wish wasn't true in some cases. Brothels along pilgrimage routes operated with church protection. In exchange for regular donations or strategic silence, certain orders looked the other way. A few even collected penance fees from pilgrims who confessed to visiting these places, then turned around and collected taxes from the establishments themselves. That's medieval capitalism at its finest. But it wasn't always transactional. On the road, emotions ran high. You meet a woman named Beatrice, a weaver from Valencia, who claims she fell in love with a Breton pilgrim somewhere. Outside Genoa, he said he'd write. She shrugs. But letters don't walk. She doesn't seem angry, just wistful. Her voice catches a little when she says his name. Love bloomed between mud and prayer. And sometimes it lasted only a few nights. Sometimes that's all it was meant to be, still. For women, pilgrimage was a mixed blessing. Traveling alone could brand them as suspicious, vulnerable, or worse, available. One group of German nuns was famously attacked en route to Rome by a band of fellow pilgrims who turned out to be ex-soldiers with less spiritual intentions. Yet, despite the risk, many women still made the journey, sometimes disguising themselves as men, sometimes banding together in groups. They carried relics and fear in equal measure. And then there's the tale of Maria of Brabant, who wrote about her travels in a now-lost letter. Copies survive in a convent archive. In it, she described seeing men bathing naked in the Jordan River, and feeling the fire of shame and curiosity in equal measure. She never touched anyone, but her language burns with desire. She ends the letter, "I did not sin, but I was not holy either." You wish you could have met her. Of course, not everyone returned home unchanged. Some brought back relics. Others brought back children. More than one noble family quietly raised a pilgrim's son whose father's name was never written down. A few of these children were claimed openly. More were passed off as nephews, wards, and minor miracles. The road left marks that couldn't be confessed away. Scholars today argue whether these journeys were spiritual tests or excuses to cut loose. The truth lies in the middle. As always, for every devout pilgrim crawling barefoot toward a shrine, there was another stopping off at an inn, buying a drink, and finding comfort in the arms of someone who understood what it meant to be far from home. As the sun sets on the winding road, the songs of travelers rise in a messy chorus. Some sing of saints, others of lovers. You see a monk with a woman at his side, their fingers brushing, a quiet story forming between them. And you know the journey isn't just about reaching a shrine. It's about everything that happens along the way. Next, you'll take a bite of forbidden fruit, elixirs, and magical concoctions said to stir the loins, bend wills, or cure a cold. Love potions, aphrodisiacs, and the dangerous art of making someone want you. You open the door to an apothecary shop and immediately feel like you've stepped into a sorcerer's pantry. The smells are overwhelming, an aggressive bouquet of lavender, moldy rose petals, bitter wormwood, and something vaguely animal. Glass jars line every shelf, filled with pickled roots, dried mushrooms, crushed beetles, and powders in shades you're not sure nature intended. In the back, a woman with ink-stained fingers is hunched over a mortar, grinding something that smells like rotting oranges and cloves. She looks up with the faint smile of someone who knows things you probably shouldn't ask about. Looking for something special, she says, to cure or to cause. Welcome to the world of medieval aphrodisiacs and love potions, where desire could be coaxed from a bottle, attraction stirred into a brew, and heartbreak cured with just the right powder, tucked into a lover's wine. In a time when open talk of sex was dangerous, people turned to plants, superstition, and a dash of kitchen witchery to get what they wanted without ever saying it out loud. She shows you a bundle of dried yarrow tied with red thread. Boil this, she says, and have him drink it before dusk. If his eyes linger on your lips afterward, it worked. Yarrow was believed to stimulate desire, especially when paired with honey and red wine. Another shelf holds crushed Cantharides Spanish fly, made from blister beetles, dried and powdered. Highly toxic, of course, but in small enough amounts. It was said to cause genital swelling and a fevered need for release or death. It was a fine line, honestly. There's a jar labeled monk's breath. Inside, dried parsley and powdered galangale. You're told it's good for cooling and overactive. Libido, given by cautious wives to pious husbands, or nervous nuns to themselves. Nearby, a small vial marked with a crude heart shape holds an infusion of mandrake root. This one's famous. Mandrake, with its vaguely human shape and eerie shriek when pulled from the ground, was said to stoke passion and create an almost mystical hunger. It was also rumored to grow beneath gallows, nourished by the final emissions of hanged men. Romantic? No. And it wasn't all about seduction. Some potions were meant for revenge. You find one recipe titled to sour a man's blood. The ingredients: mustard seed, sour wine, grave dirt, and fingernail clippings. Women would slip a few drops into a lover's drink to make him weak, less aggressive, or, in some cases, impotent. Whether it worked or not didn't matter. The belief did. Still, most of these concoctions weren't evil or malicious. They were just hopeful. In a world where marriages were arranged, options limited, and desire often dangerous, people reached for control wherever they could find it. A girl with no dowry might try a love charm to catch a merchant's eye. A young man too shy to speak might wear a bag of rosemary and anise sewn into his shirt, praying the scent would give him confidence. Every herb had meaning, every blend a story. You learned that garlic rubbed on the thighs was thought to bring heat to the loins. Nutmeg, powdered and sprinkled on wine, was believed to loosen tongues and tighten bedsheets. Fennel, when worn in a locket, could repel unwanted attention, which feels like the medieval version of ghosting. There's even a practice where lovers wrote each other's names on bay leaves, tied them to their ankles, and danced under the moon to ensure fidelity. The ritual ends with burning the leaves. If the flame crackles, your love is true. If it hisses, someone's cheating. But not all love magic was herbal. There were prayers, incantations, and talismans. 2.1 Common charm involved writing the names of the three Magicaspar, Melchior and Balthazar on a piece of parchment and hiding it in your lover's shoe. Supposedly, this would make them dream of you and wake up with their heart tilted in your direction. Another involved pressing a blessed coin to the tongue and whispering your beloved's name 9 times. If they looked at you before sunset, the spell had worked. And here's your odd fact for the night. In some rural regions of Eastern Europe, villagers believed that semen collected from a linen bedsheet could be used to create a love salve when mixed with rose oil and ground bees. The concoction, rubbed on the lips and wrists, supposedly made one irresistible. You try not to gag. The desperation is palpable, but also kind of poetic. People were willing to believe in anything if it meant being wanted. Of course, the church hated all of this. Love magic was considered a form of sorcery. Aphrodisiacs, especially those that worked without consent, bordered on demonic. Women caught making love charms could be charged with witchcraft. One woman in 1327 was accused of causing a man's unnatural fixation by boiling a love root in goat milk under the new moon. Her punishment: flogging and exile. The man got a sermon and a slap on the wrist, but people didn't stop. They just got quieter. Recipes passed from mother to daughter, lover to lover, hidden in cookbooks between soup instructions, or scribbled in margins of medical texts. Some wore their charms in hair braids. Others stitched them into the hems of dresses. If you were clever, no one ever knew. Historians still debate how seriously to take these recipes. Were they actual attempts at chemistry, emotional placebos, or just rituals, little acts of control in a world full of uncertainty? Probably all three. What's certain is that the desire to influence love, to surlist, and to protect or provoke the heart was as real as any miracle claimed from a saint's shrine. As you leave the apothecary, a girl with a basket slips past you, a sprig of rosemary tucked behind her ear. She looks back just once to see if anyone noticed. You didn't, maybe someone else will too. Next, you'll climb the steps of castles and courtrooms to see how marriage and power twisted together where monogamy was preached. But political alliances often came with side flings, concubines, and expectations that had little to do with love. You're in the great hall of a stone castle now, under a ceiling so high it seems more concerned with impressing God than keeping the heat in. Tapestries line the walls, scenes of hunts, battles, and noble weddings where no one looks particularly happy. The lord and lady sit on their thrones, surrounded by attendants and stewards, and not a single romantic spark. You're watching a marriage that's less about vows and more about assets. Because in medieval Europe, love rarely had anything to do with who stood beside you at the altar. Marriage was strategy. Lust, that came later if it came at all. You study the couple. She's 17 and freshly imported from the rival barony. Her dowry includes 2 vineyards and a corner of disputed forest. He's 34, with thinning hair and a reputation for gambling. Their union was arranged when she was still a child, sealed with a signature and a goblet of wine. Not whispers in the dark. You can feel the chill between them even now, despite the fire crackling at their feet. Monogamy was the church's official stance, of course. One man, one woman, joined under God, with no room for wandering eyes or hands. But that rule was applied unevenly at best. For nobles and royals, marriage was a Tula political contract, an alliance brokered in bloodlines and land. Everyone expected a husband to have mistresses. Everyone expected a wife to look the other way. Fidelity was a virtue, not a requirement. You recall the case of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII. Their marriage was an unqualified disaster politically and sexually. She was sharp-tongued and confident. He was devout, awkward, and barely interested. They produced 2 daughters, no sons, and after years of frosty silences, she had the marriage annulled. Her next husband, Henry II of England. They had 8 children, at least 2 legendary affairs, and enough marital dysfunction to fuel a Shakespeare cycle. Monogamy, clearly, was flexible, but while kings and lords had room to roam, women didn't. A wife caught in adultery could lose her title, her landavin, her life. In some regions, an unfaithful noblewoman was imprisoned or forced into a convent. One duchess in Brittany was sewn into a sack and drowned for a rumored affair with a knight. Her lover was flogged mildly, then reassigned to a post in the countryside. Justice, medieval style. Not all powerful women accepted this quietly. You read about a Castilian queen who kept her own lovers and dared anyone to challenge her. One of them, a poet, wrote that she touched him like a lioness and ruled him like a king. She wasn't punished, her bloodline was too valuable, but her name was scrubbed from several court records, as if desire itself were something you could redact. It wasn't just nobility playing the game. Wealthy merchants in cities like Florence and Bruges also arranged marriages for profit. Their wives were expected to be silent, fertile, and dressed appropriately. One record shows a man fining his wife 10 silver coins for wearing green silk, without prior approval. Another forbade his spouse from singing during supper because it was too joyful for a matron. Meanwhile, the same men kept courtesans on stipends and visited brothels under the guise of business meetings. And here's your quirky fact for the night. In 14th century Italy, there was a custom called friar, where noblemen arranged for their wives to have social companions, younger men, often poets or musicians, who were allowed to escort them to events, flatter them, and even share private moments. Officially, it was all very platonic. Unofficially, well, the husbands weren't exactly checking in every night. Some of these companions ended up in the wives' wills, or in anonymous poetry that never quite died out. The church kept trying to intervene. Bishops preached that marriage was sacred, and any deviation from it would lead to eternal damnation or worse, scandal. Priests gave sermons on the sanctity of the marriage bed, but they rarely called out powerful men. The rules were strict for peasants, enforced for commoners, and optional for anyone with a title. You start to realize that medieval monogamy was more about managing appearances than managing desire. Even the marriage ceremony itself had multiple versions. The church preferred marriages to happen before a priest, with witnesses and vows. But plenty of unions were sealed with nothing more than a verbal promise and a roll in the hay. Canon law eventually recognized these so-called clandestine marriages if they met certain criteria: mutual consent and consummation. In one famous case, a woman proved her marriage by producing the stained sheets knot from the wedding night. But from a week before, behind a barn. Divorce, in the modern sense, didn't exist. Annulments did, but they were expensive and required a good excuse. Usually consanguinity. Turns out you were cousins. Impotence or vinculum. The marriage hadn't been consummated. Some couples faked these things to escape unhappy pairings. One man even hired a friend to testify that his wife smelled so foul it prevented intimacy. She claimed he simply didn't know what he was doing. The court ruled in her favor. Polygamy, officially banned, still made shadow appearances. Kings took concubines. Nobles kept unofficial second wives. In some cases, especially in border regions or among crusaders far from home, men had temporary wives, women they lived with, fathered children with, and then abandoned when they returned. The church occasionally tried to legitimize these unions or baptize the children, but mostly they were just brushed under the velvet rug of political expediency. Scholars still argue over whether medieval people believed in romantic love within marriage. Some did. You read letters between noble spouses filled with real affection. One knight wrote to his wife, "Your absence wounds me like a blade, and your letters are my only bandage." Sweet, right? But they were the exception, not the rule. Most marriages were work, strategic, public, controlled. As you leave the hall, the newlyweds are nowhere to be seen. Upstairs, their bedding is probably being watched by the chaperones, with wine, breath, and high expectations. Whether they find desire or just duty tonight, no one seems to care. The alliance is made, the land is secured, the rest is details. Next, you'll sneak down into the cellar of lineage, the place where illegitimate children were born, hidden, claimed, or cast aside, because nothing complicates medieval sex more than a baby born in the wrong bed. The hallway is narrow, the candles low. You follow a midwife down a winding back stair, past the sleeping nobles and polished halls of a manor house that pretends everything is perfectly in order. But below the grandeur, secrets swell like mildew behind fine tapestries. You step into a chamber tucked behind the kitchens, where a fire crackles and a woman cries softly into a wool blanket. She's just given birth, and from the looks exchanged between the midwife and the nursemaid, this child won't be celebrated. It wasn't born of marriage. It wasn't expected, and it's not entirely welcome. Illegitimate children in medieval society lived at the jagged edge of propriety, sometimes protected, sometimes punished, always precarious. Everything depended on who your parents were and how willing they were to admit what happened in the dark. This baby, red-faced and squalling, is the daughter of a nobleman and a servant girl. He'll never acknowledge her. He already has a legitimate heir upstairs, plump and rosy, and watched by 4 nurses. But he might offer a purse of coins to the mother, a cradle, maybe a place in a convent when she's old enough, or maybe not. The girls were sent away to foster homes or taken in by nuns, raised as orphans with suspiciously generous dowries. Other times, they were left at church doors with only a note and a whispered prayer. Among peasants, things were both simpler and harsher. A child born out of wedlock meant shame, yes, but it also meant fewer consequences. Unless the father refused to claim responsibility, bastardy fines existed in many villages. The man paid a small fee, and the woman performed penance, often publicly, barefoot in church. But even in smaller communities, rumors had weight. A girl with a child and no husband became unmarriageable. Her options, beg, work, or hope. A wandering friar took mercy in the noble class. Illegitimacy was an open secret with elaborate etiquette. Kings had official mistresses, complete with households, titles, and children who were raised just a rung, or to below the legitimate heirs. You read about Charles II of Navarre, who installed his favorite mistress in a tower near the castle and sent his own wife letters filled with polite apologies and zero intention of ending the affair. Their children were educated, given land, sometimes even entered the clergy or married minor nobility. Some of these royal bastards became powerful figures in their own right. William the Conqueror, yes, that William was famously known as William the Bastard before he took England by storm in 1066. His illegitimacy didn't stop him. In fact, he wore the insult like armor. Others weren't so lucky. Illegitimate sons could be barred from inheritance, denied titles, or forced into the church, whether they wanted it or not. Women fared even worse. A nobleman's bastard daughter might be married off to a minor knight or sent to a nunnery. If she was exceptionally beautiful, she might follow in her mother's footsteps and become someone else's mistress. But love was rarely part of the equation. Legitimacy shaped futures, and the stain of being born on the wrong side of the sheets could last a lifetime. And here's your fringe fact for the night. In 13th century England, there was an actual legal term, filius nullius, used in court to refer to an illegitimate child. It means son of no one. Imagine being addressed like that in front of your neighbors. It wasn't just social, it was legal erasure. Bastards couldn't inherit unless formally legitimized by royal decree or papal blessing. And yes, people paid a lot to get those. Still, some tried to game the system. You come across a forged marriage document, crude handwriting, a fake priest's name. The nobleman used it to claim his mistress had actually been his secret wife all along, thereby making their son legitimate. The ruse lasted 6 months before the real priest turned up and ruined everything. The son was stripped of inheritance, and the mistress mysteriously died during illness. You don't ask questions. Sometimes the opposite happens. Lovers married after the child was born, hoping that a post-facto wedding would clean things up. Canon law had debates about this for centuries. Could marriage retroactively legitimize children? The answer changed depending on which pope you asked. Some said yes. Others, absolutely not. Scholars still argue whether these shifting rules were acts of mercy, or just a cynical way to control inheritance and keep power in the right hands. But not every story ends in tragedy. You meet a boy named Tomas, born of a merchant, and his seamstress, mistress. The father never married the mother, but he paid for Tomas's education and apprenticed him to a scribe. Now grown, Tomas writes contracts for land deals and has the neatest penmanship in the county. He's not nobility. He'll never inherit a manor, but he's respected, clean-clothed, and fully aware of where he came from. My mother gave me her name, he says. My father gave me his coin. That's enough. You realize that for many, survival meant finding power in the margins. Bastards weren't necessarily doomed. They were just uninvited to the table. Some found ways to climb in through the side door. Others built new tables entirely. There's an open scholarly debate about how widespread social mobility really was for illegitimate children. Were exceptions, like William or Tomas, rare sparks in a bleak landscape? Or was society more flexible than we give it credit for? Some evidence suggests that, particularly in cities, bastardy lost some of its stigma over time, especially if the child could be useful, talented, or married off discreetly. Others argue that the stain of illegitimacy clung tight no matter how well someone performed. You leave the manor house quietly, careful not to wake anyone. The nursemaid hums softly to the newborn in the lower room. Upstairs, the nobleman is asleep beside his lawful wife, dreaming, perhaps, of neither. Somewhere in between, a life has just begun, unwanted in one sense, but not unloved. Maybe the real secret here, for all the laws and shame, the heart still found ways to break the rules. Next, you'll slip into more radical spaces where heretics preach salvation through sex. Couples share each other as property of the divine. And free love means something far older and stranger than Woodstock ever imagined. You've wandered far off the main road now, past the manors and monasteries, beyond the reach of bishops and barons. You're in a clearing ringed by trees that seem to lean in just a little too close, as if they've heard something they shouldn't repeat. There's a small gathering around a fire, men and women, young and old, cloaked in simple wool and quiet defiance. One woman sings softly, her voice weaving through the smoke. Another reads from a scroll not recognized by any official church. You've found the heretics, the radicals, the ones who dared to mix sex and salvation and weren't all that sorry about it. Welcome to the fringe movements of medieval Christianity, where doctrine is loose, desire is spiritual, and nothing is quite what it seems. You're about to meet people who believed fervently that God lived not in celibacy, but in the body, that the divine could be accessed through touch, that denying pleasure was the real sin. You sit beside a man named Elias, broad-shouldered and intense, with fingers stained from copying texts. He tells you he's part of the Brethren of the Free Spirit, a loosely organized, wildly controversial movement that gained traction across parts of the Holy Roman Empire and Low Countries in the 13th and 14th centuries. Their core belief that once a soul was truly united with God, it transcended sin, which meant that anything they did, anything, was no longer sinful, including sex, especially sex. The church, predictably, was horrified. The Brethren rejected sacraments, ignored clerical authority, and most outrageously, some of their members claimed to be literally divine. "I am God," one female mystic allegedly said, "and everything I do is holy." You imagine how well that went over in Rome, but the ideas spread. One woman, Margaret Porete, wrote a mystical treatise called The Mirror of Simple Souls, which argued that the soul must surrender to divine love completely, even if that meant abandoning moral law. The church burned her at the stake in 1310, but her book kept circulating underground. Scholars still debate whether she practiced sexual mysticism herself, but others certainly did. You hear about sects where members stripped naked during rituals, both symbolic and literal acts of shedding sin. In some communities, couples shared each other as expressions of divine unity. One heretical group believed that true purity came only after full indulgence, that you had to experience all earthly pleasure before you could be truly free of it. Imagine explaining that to your confessor. And here's your fringe fact for the night. In 14th century Bohemia, a radical sect called the Adamites lived communally, rejected clothing entirely, and believed that prelapsarian nudity, that is, the naked state of Adam and Eve before the fall, was the purest form of existence. They danced, sang, and slept together in the open, claiming they had return to Eden. The church sent troops. It did not end well. You listen as a woman named Clara speaks. She's in her 30s, with a crescent-shaped scar at her temple and eyes that watch everything. She talks about love, not just romantic love, but sacred eros. The flesh, she says, is the scroll where God writes. For her, sex isn't just human, it's holy. She describes how, in certain rituals, lovers recite psalms during climax. How prayer becomes a kind of foreplay. How kissing, when done with intention, becomes a sacrament. Not everyone in the group practices this so reverently. Some still wrestle with guilt. Others walk both worlds, tending Mass by day, then returning to the woods by night, and yet you sense a quiet conviction among them. They're not rebelling for the thrill. They genuinely believe that desire, when embraced honestly, brings them closer to the divine. Of course, the institutional church saw this as a threat, not just the theology, but the liberation. If people didn't fear sin, how could you control them? If women claimed sexual autonomy as spiritual truth, how could you silence them? And perhaps most terrifying of all, if peasants and wanderers could find salvation without priests or confession, what was left for the hierarchy to do? Inquisition. Records from France and Germany are filled with frenzied accounts of these groups, but the line between truth and slander is thin. Did the brethren really engage in orgies, or were they accused of it because they dared to question authority? Were the Adamites dangerous, or just inconveniently naked? Even modern scholars can't agree. Some see these movements as proto-feminist, proto-egalitarian responses to a repressive church. Others argue they were chaotic, misguided, and occasionally exploitative. You meet a young couple, Mira and John, who've been living among the free spirit followers for 2 years. They tell you they used to be married in the official church. There was love, Mira says, but no freedom. Here they sleep with other partners, sometimes together, sometimes not, but always with consent, John adds. Always with grace. You can't tell if it's working, but they look contented, ecstatic, not ashamed, just peaceful in their bodies. Still, the risk is real. If they're caught, they could be tortured, executed, erased. One former member was burned for claiming unity with God through fornication. The word fornication was underlined in red ink, probably by someone with more fear than understanding. You realize how radical it truly is to take something the church labeled shameful and claim it as holy. To say, my pleasure does not condemn me, it connects me to the divine. It's dangerous thinking, transformative thinking, and maybe, just maybe, it's why these groups keep reappearing in history like stubborn wildflowers. You burn them, bury them, condemn them, and they come back. You leave the clearing under a sky slick with stars. Someone sings softly behind you, and the fire crackles like a heartbeat. You're not sure you believe what they believe, but you understand it, because in a world built on control, sometimes the most sacred act is simply wanting without apology. Next, you'll find yourself behind monastery walls and convent doors, where abstinence is the rule, but longing lingers in silence. Sand, where saints dream of kisses and monks carve their guilt into stone. The village fades behind you as the trees thin, giving way to a small stone chapel and an adjoining cluster of buildings that squat low against the wind. It's peaceful here, with rows of herbs growing beside a crumbling wall and a cow chewing slowly in a paddock, looking deeply uninterested in your arrival. But beyond the serenity, there's something else faint, tension hanging in the air like smoke. You've come to witness one of medieval history's strangest obsessions, the trials of animals, where humans projected their lust, shame, and absurd moral panic onto creatures that couldn't defend themselves. That's right. In the Middle Ages, animals stood trial, real ones with judges and witnesses, and accusations that usually sounded like fever. Dreams scribbled by a monk on a bad mushroom trip. And many of these trials, absurd as it sounds, centered on sex. You step into a small church courtroom where the scent of incense can't quite mask the underlying aroma of something more barnyard. At the front, a pig sits chained beside a bailiff, squealing occasionally. The crowd watches grimly. The charge, carnal knowledge of a child. The prosecutor, a local priest, reads the indictment aloud, voice trembling with equal parts disgust and piety. The audience nods solemnly. You want to scream. The pig scratches itself. This wasn't an isolated case. Dozens, maybe hundreds of animal trials took place across medieval Europe. Pigs, bulls, goats, and even roosters were brought to courtrooms and accused of crimes, often sexual in nature. In 1386, in Falaise, France, a pig was dressed in human clothes, tried for murder and unnatural acts, and hanged in public. In another case, a donkey was investigated for alleged lewd behavior with a farmer, but, plot twist, the donkey was acquitted because multiple witnesses testified to its modesty and Christian demeanor. Yes, seriously, you sit beside an old scribe who's documenting today's proceedings. He sighs deeply and explains that these trials, while ridiculous now, were deadly serious then. To the medieval mind, animals weren't just beasts, they were part of God's ordered world. If a creature broke that order, it had to be punished. Otherwise, divine justice would falter. In other words, they weren't just punishing the pig, they were restoring cosmic balance, or at least pretending to. But of course, there's more going on here. Beneath the surface of these animal trials lurks a mess of human emotions, guilt, projection, and repressed desire. In many cases, it seems likely that the animals were scapegoats, convenient targets, when the real crimes were too horrifying to face directly. A child found dead, blame the goat. A woman discovered with unexplained injuries, blame the dog. The actual culprits, fun neighbors, relatives, or authority figures, went unpunished or unmentioned. And here's your fringe fact for the night. In 1474, a rooster in Basel, Switzerland, was put on trial for laying an egg, something no rooster should be able to do. That the egg was declared the spawn of the devil, and the rooster was burned at the stake. Medieval people believed that a rooster's egg could hatch a basilisk, a monster so deadly its gaze could kill. You can almost imagine the priest scribbling that in his notebook and then praying for a stiff drink. The church did its part to stoke these fears. Sermons warned that sexual sin could infect the world around you, that even animals might become instruments of corruption. One particularly creative preacher insisted that demons often entered livestock to commit impure acts and tempt the faithful, which meant, somehow, that your cow's lustful eyes were the devil's doing. There's a reason medieval bestiaries often included bizarre moral lessons beside animal descriptions. The lion was noble, the owl was wise. The weasel was a sex maniac. The hedgehog hoarded fruit and sin. Everything had meaning, usually sexual, usually terrifying. Scholars have tried to make sense of this medieval madness. Some say it reflects a deep anxiety about control over the body, over the household, over nature itself. Animals were symbolic stand-ins for urges that couldn't be named aloud. Others argue it was a way of reinforcing power, holding a trial even, a fake one, for a pigger-minded everyone, that justice flowed from the top down. The court ruled. The public watched. Order was restored, however farcically. But there's a darker side to all this. You come across records of women accused of unnatural acts with animals, usually based on hearsay, jealousy, or suspicion. These women were rarely tried fairly, often executed. Their supposed partners were put down to completing the ritual of shame. In some cases, there's no evidence of a crime at all. Just a woman who lived alone, had too many cats, or refused to marry. You start to see how quickly fear and sexuality spiral into violence when mixed with superstition. Still, obscurity. One case in 15th century Burgundy involved a group of rats accused of stealing grain. The rats were summoned to court. Yes, literally summoned, but didn't show up. The defense lawyer argued they had a right to safe passage and were probably deterred by the presence of cats. The judge, possibly realizing the absurdity, let it go. And yes, this actually happened with written transcripts. You leave the courtroom shaking your head. Verdict pending. Life continues. Bizarre and brutal in equal measure. And you wonder how many of these trials were less about animals and more about our own refusal to face ourselves. Because when people can't deal with their own desires, their own shame, they find something else to punish. A goat, a girl, a rooster with a mysterious egg. Next, you'll find yourself under a death-shrouded sky, in a time when the plague tore through every certainty, and lust became both a last defiance and a whispered prayer before the dry and distant at first, like the crack of twigs in the wind. But as you get closer, it grows wetter, heavier, like something being torn from inside a body. You step into a town in mourning, though no one has had the time to carve the word into stone yet. The plague is here. Bubonic, the Black Death. Call it what you like. Someone throws a rosary after it. Someone else throws up. And in the thick of it all, you find something unexpected. People still reaching for each other, still touching, still aching to feel alive, even when death is already in the room. The world is ending again and again. And medieval people, it turns out, had the same reaction many of us might. Panic, prayer, and pleasure. Some turned holy, others turned wild. The barkeep is coughing into his sleeve, but still pouring ale. Two men argue about whether the world will end in fire or frogs. Sit beside a weaver named Hal, who lost 3 brothers last week and hasn't blinked since Tuesday. We're all damned, he says casually, as if commenting on the weather. Might as well have some warmth on the way down. That attitude, surprisingly common, gave rise to a strange surge in erotic behavior during the plague years. People flocked to brothels, not just for sex, but for comfort, for escape, for the illusion that life still had some sweetness left. Others engaged in spontaneous affairs, public displays of desire, and risked the wrath of both God and coughing neighbors to feel another body press against theirs. Some of it was desperation, some of it was defiance. When you believe the sky is about to fall, rules get fuzzy. Morality becomes optional. One chronicler from Avignon wrote bitterly of men who had never spoken to a whore before, now spending their last pennies in her bed, declaring love with every dying breath. He sounded disgusted, but you suspect he was also jealous. And here's your fringe fact of the night. In a few plague-stricken towns, they figured if people were going to die, they might as well be distracted in Paris. Some brothels even received temporary protection, considered relief services by desperate city councils, bodies for hire. One official wrote, to soothe the minds of the terrified, you try not to let the irony swallow you whole. But not everyone welcomed this frenzy of flesh. The church, as expected, thundered against it. Sermons doubled down. Priests called the plague a punishment for sexual sin, and accused those who continued to lie together of dragging the rest of the world into hell with them. The fornicator, you have to admit, has a certain poetic ring to it. Flagellant movements rose up in response. Groups of men who whipped themselves through the streets, begging for forgiveness and driving out desire one lash at a time. Some of them forbade sex entirely, even between married couples, arguing that abstinence might spare their souls. Others, paradoxically, became so consumed with holiness that they slipped into a kind of ecstatic trance, moaning and writhing in what looked suspiciously like something else. Scholars still argue over whether these were spiritual seizures or thinly veiled orgasms. The line between pain and pleasure was blurred, especially when God was watching. And there's the rub. Everything became symbolic. A kiss was defiance. An orgasm was rebellion. Holding someone's hand as the boils rose on your neck wasn't just romance, it was war against despair. You meet a young woman named Elsa, cheeks flushed, eyes hollowed from weeks of bad sleep and bad air. She tells you she slept with the same man who buried her sister. We didn't mean to, she says, voice barely above a whisper. We just didn't want to be alone. Not that night. He's dead now. She isn't yet. Bodies were everywhere. After all, in piles, in beds, in fevered dreams, the line between death and desire got twisted fast. Some believed that lust itself spread the plague, especially among the poor. Others believed it was the rich who brought the disease. From their travels, their luxuries, their excess, nobody really knew. The fleas didn't discriminate, but still, people tried to love, and sometimes, named to say in the dark, one young scribe wrote, that he shared his bed with a girl from a rival village for a week during the worst of it. We didn't speak much. There's no record of what happened to her, and yet, amidst all this yearning, not all touches were tender. The breakdown of social order opened the door to exploitation. To desperate women were forced into sex for shelter. Children were abandoned or sold. Brothels turned into death traps. There are accounts of men robbing plague corpses, then returning to their lovers without even washing their hands. The sickness didn't just rot lungs, it rotted conscience. Still, even in this decay, you feel something deeply human holding on in a makeshift shelter outside the town walls. Two people share a thin blanket, their fingers barely brushing, and that simple connection carries more power than 100 sermons. They aren't pretending they're safe. They aren't even pretending they're clean. They're just choosing to feel something before the lights go out. Scholars today still wrestle with the paradox of plague and passion. Some argue the increased eroticism was a natural response to trauma. Others suggest it was always there, just unmasked by mortality. When everything else is taken, the body remains. From the town, the coughing fades behind you. The night is heavy, but the stars are shockingly bright. Somewhere, another cart is being loaded. Somewhere else, a kiss lands on a fevered cheek. Life, stubborn as it is, goes on. Next, you'll step into the final rooms of this world. A place of last confessions and long shadows, where death meets desire in stained glass and tombstone carvings, and lust writes itself into memory. Even after the lights go out, the cathedral looms ahead like a ship made of shadow and stone, its spires cutting into a sky bruised with twilight. You walk toward it slowly, boots echoing on worn cobblestone, slick with yesterday's rain. This is the end of the journey. Not just yours, but theirs, the Lord's, the lovers, the outlaws, the sinners. Now you're stepping into the place where they all eventually come to be remembered or to be forgotten. Inside, the light is dim, caught in colored glass that scatters fragments of saints across the flagstones. The air smells of wax and old prayers layered thick like dust. You pass rows of wooden pews and an altar dressed in gold, each etched with Latin dates and the soft lies of remembrance. Faithful husband, beloved wife, pillar of virtue. You pause at one, a knight in full armor, a woman beside him, both hands folded, eyes shut, lips still parted slightly, lovers cast in stone. Death in the Middle Ages was everywhere, and yet, for all its daily presence, it never stopped being dramatic. People planned for it obsessively, rewrote their wills, purchased indulgences, commissioned artwork, and even in death, the question of sex lingered. Who had been with whom? Who had strayed? But human memory wasn't so tidy, and neither were the gravestones. You run your fingers along one monument that's clearly had its inscription scraped off and rewritten. The new name barely hides the old grooves. Rumor has it, the man buried here was excommunicated for keeping 2 wives, one in town, one in the countryside, and neither knew about the other until his funeral. Apparently, they met while placing flowers. Things got ugly. Someone threw a candle. But these aren't just monuments. They're warnings, celebrations, excuses. The language of virtue was often code. Chaste sometimes meant got caught and repented. Modest could mean kept her secrets well. One widow, buried with a carved lily and the word pudica, meaning pure, was later revealed in court records to have run a high-end brothel out of her wine cellar. You almost admire the symmetry. Everyone dies. Not everyone gets carved in stone as a virgin saint. Then there's the art. Death and lust shared. The same palette. You trace the lines of a stained glass window, showing Mary Magdalene not kneeling in repentance, but washing Christ's feet with her hair, her face tender and a little too intimate for comfort. Behind her, a bishop scowls, as if he can feel the confusion she causes. For centuries, Magdalene was the church's favorite symbol of fallen womanhood and redemption, a safe place to park all the unease around female sexuality, want sanctified, desire domesticated. On a column nearby, Someone long ago carved a tiny pair of intertwined figures, barely noticeable unless you know where to look. Their faces are rough, weathered by time, but their position is unmistakable. You wonder if a bored mason left them there on a dare, or if it was a tribute, maybe even a memory. Because, for all the church's lectures and threats, desire still seeped into the very walls, quietly, persistently. You walk into a side chapel and find a display of death masks, faces cast from wax and painted to resemble the deceased. Most are stoic, a few are smiling. One has lips parted just slightly, teeth barely showing. It's unsettling. She was a noblewoman, they say, who died in childbirth, but her journals survived, and in them she wrote long passages about a lover she never named. He brought her pressed violets, touched her face like she might vanish. She never mentioned her husband, not once. And here's your fringe fact of the night. Some medieval tombs were designed with transy sculptures, effigies, showing the person as they were in life on top, and beneath it, a rotting corpse, flesh above, decay below. A reminder that beauty fades, bones endure, and lust, no matter how vivid, ends here, or seems to. But even in death, desire found its echoes. You read about ghost stories, widows dreaming of long-dead lovers who visit them at night. Spectral hands brushing thighs, kisses like cold breath. Monks wrote of temptations that lingered in their dreams, voices of old lovers whispering from beyond. Were they hauntings, memories, guilt? No one could say. Scholars still argue over how medieval people balanced their fear of damnation with the inevitability of desire. Some suggest they lived in constant cognitive dissonance, publicly condemning what they privately craved. Others believe they were more honest than we give them credit for, navigating lust and sin as parts of life, not contradictions, but companions. Either way, the tombstones don't tell the whole story. You leave the cathedral as the bells begin to ring. A funeral procession passes you, mourners in black, a casket of polished oak, incense trailing behind. Among them walks a woman with her hand clutched tight to a locket. You don't ask what's inside. You already know. Outside, the wind has shifted. You're standing at the edge of a world that once felt eternal but is now quiet. Save for your footsteps, you've traced the shape of medieval lust, from the giggles behind market stalls to the ritualized silences of the convent, from flagellation to fornication, from passion to plague. You've seen how people touched and were touched, how they confessed, denied, longed, burned, and finally were buried. Next, as the candles flicker low and the story slips into silence, it's time to wind down with a final breath, a soft descent into sleep, where history rests beside you like a lover with secrets yet to tell. The fire is low now, a hush settling in like dust on forgotten parchment. You sit quietly, letting everything you've seen drift through your thoughts. The low laughter in taverns, the whispered prayers behind cloistered doors, the creak of a bed frame that shouldn't be making that sound in a nunnery, the rustle of parchment scribbled with secrets too tender for the light of day. It's all there, folding gently into memory. You've walked through a world that both feared and worshipped desire, where sermons warned you away from lust even as saints dreamed of divine kisses, where rules were written in stone but broken in soft, hallways by candlelight or beneath the weight of too much wine. You've met noble women who took lovers in silence, monks who wept after pleasure, poets who turned their longing into art, and peasants who held each other close as the plague drew its last breath. You've learned that sin in medieval times wasn't just something done, it was something felt, carried, confessed, and sometimes embraced. Maybe you've come away a little more skeptical of those stained glass halos. Or maybe you've come to understand that the past was never as clean or as cold as textbooks like to pretend. The truth is, desire has always pulsed just beneath the surface. Messy, tender, shameful, sacred. So, as you ease under the covers tonight, remember, history isn't made only in battlefields and courts, but in bedrooms and back alleys, in love letters and lace hems, in quiet, aching moments that no one thought to write down, but somehow survived anyway. The lights are low, the story's done, and the past, for now, can